When he was out of the room, Klein carefully held his cane and lantern in the same hand, leaving his left hand free so that he could retrieve the contents of his pocket as quickly as possible in the event there was a sudden turn of events. Inside, there were charms, Azek's characteristic, some tarot cards, and apart from the remaining Rosago's characteristic, the all-black eye, his pocket contained all the means available to him. Klein and Miss Bodyguard had barely taken a step to the side when the light of the lantern illuminated the emblem on the door next to them. It was a simple drawing of a baby surrounded by the symbols of wheat, flowers, and spring water. The sacred emblem of Mother Earth, Klein said in a solemn voice. As a former Nighthawk, one of his basic skills was being able to distinguish the symbols of other churches. Miss Bodyguard nodded slightly, as though to confirm this. Her black Gothic regal dress looked even eerier and terrifying in such an environment and atmosphere. Her pale face looked like a grieving wraith under the illumination of the lantern. If any other adventurer were to come here and see this scene, they would definitely flee while stumbling out of fear. Holding his breath, Klein reached out with his left hand, pushed open the stone door, and raised the lantern high. He found that the layout here was very similar to the one before, like a perfect fusion between a small prayer room and a giant statue. Across the empty wheat-colored stone tiles, Klein illuminated the 3 steps ahead of him with a lantern. On the platform was a white stone sculpture about 4 or 5 meters tall. It was a plump and beautiful lady, with ears of wheat growing from her feet, and she was surrounded by spring water. Her dress seemed to flutter, and embedded in it, there were different herbs and flowers, as well as the depiction of different animals. The lady's chest was raised high, and in her arms was an adorable infant in swaddling clothes. She stood there, tall and sacred. "Don't tell me that this is the statue of Mother Earth?" Klein said softly with his lips curled. Miss Bodyguard didn't answer or deny it. After checking their surroundings, the duo left the room and opened the 3rd door nearby. Behind this door was a corridor that allowed 4 people to walk alongside each other. Ahead of them, it was dark and deep, filled with mystery and oddities. It was unknown where it led to. "Let's first confirm the situation behind the 4 doors on the right," Klein suggested. He didn't dare to rashly enter. Using her actions as an answer, Miss Bodyguard floated backward. The duo opened the 4 stone doors on the right, in succession. They separately saw the storm-sacred emblem, which was made up of the symbol of gales and stormy waves, the sacred emblem of the sun, which was surrounded by lines, the sacred emblems of the god of combat, which was made from the combination of the symbol for dusk and a sword-shaped symbol, as well as the sacred emblem of knowledge and wisdom, which was represented by an open book and an omniscient eye. In contrast, there were 4 suspected statues of deities in the room. A dignified middle-aged man in black armor, standing over churning waves, surrounded by stormy winds, with lightning flashing behind him and a trident in his hand. There was a young man in a pure white robe, holding a book of deeds in one hand and a golden sphere which resembled the sun in the other. He was handsome and spirited. There was a warrior sitting on a throne high above, holding a sword in front of him. His face was hidden behind his helmet's visor, his entire body covered with an indescribable sense of decay. There was a hooded elder holding a book in the omniscient eye, with only his mouth, wrinkles, and long white beard exposed. Apart from the god of steam and machinery, there were 6 humanoid statues of the orthodox gods in this strange hall. Considering the weak position of the Church of the God of Steam and Machinery before the appearance of Russell, there seemed to be some sort of explanation regarding this problem. "This is really strange," Klein exclaimed with a sigh, partially because he couldn't stop it, and partially because he was testing Miss Bodyguard's reaction. This grand hall, which was 100 meters deep, actually had 6 of the Orthodox gods collected within it. This was something unimaginable in the current era. How could the Church of the 6 True Gods allow their gods to live in the same structure as the other gods? This was a custom that only existed during the 4th epoch? Also, what's with those humanoid statues? Although they look normal, unlike the sinister primordial demoness and the true creator statues, they still give off weird vibes. Just what had happened to make the images of the 6 gods evolve into abstract symbols in this day of age? No, perhaps it's been like this all this time, but the master of this place, a noble who suspected to be a member of the Tudor family, purposely created statues of the 6 deities for some purpose. I thought of an item from a novel from my previous life, the 6-soul banner. While he waited for Miss Bodyguard's reply, Klein's mind wandered. Miss Bodyguard didn't answer his query and instead said blandly, "There's another door." That's right. Klein suddenly felt fear. From his point of view, doors placed in the middle often had a special meaning, perhaps the core region of this ancient structure. Of course, this also likely implied the highest amount of danger. In his opinion, doors placed in the center often had a special meaning, perhaps the core of this ancient building. Of course, this also meant that the situation was most likely the most dangerous. What are your thoughts on that area? Klein hesitated for 2 seconds and directly asked. Under the situation of not being able to use the gray fog to eliminate any interference, he felt that Miss Bodyguard's spiritual perception and spiritual instincts were more reliable than his divination means at present. After all, she was in a very special state, close to that of a spiritual body, allowing her to communicate with the spirit world without any obstruction to gain revelations. Miss Bodyguard closed her eyes and replied a few seconds later, very dangerous. But the danger is subdued. Once you venture deeper, don't touch anything. Subdued danger. Is this equivalent to having something sealed inside? As Klein guessed, he and Miss Bodyguard walked to the central stone door and stepped onto the dark floor. The light of the lantern seemed to dim a little as though it found it difficult to drive out the darkness ahead. Klein had his left hand in his pocket, holding Azek's copper whistle and a few charms. After about 30 steps, Miss Bodyguard suddenly stopped. Klein raised the lantern in his right hand and saw that the road ahead was blocked by boulders and dirt. On the left and right were 2 stone doors in the same shape as the ones in the main hall. The right side was ajar and filled with mud and stone. Perhaps this ancient structure was above ground back then, but for some reason, it eventually sank and collapsed, Klein mumbled. There's only one direction we can choose from. Before he could finish his words, he saw Miss Bodyguard float ahead, stick to the huge rock, fuse into it, and disappear. Klein's mouth twitched, and he began to patiently wait. After a few minutes, Miss Bodyguard came out from the mud on the right, her body completely free of dust. It's completely collapsed, she concluded flatly. For a moment Klein was speechless and could only smile. Following that, the two of them simultaneously looked to the left where the ajar stone door was. There was a tiny crack. Klein went closer and carefully looked through the 3-centimeter gap. His spirit vision, which had originally been blocked by the stone door, immediately discovered something. There were at least 4 bright and powerful spiritual lights inside, 2 that were close to dark gold in color, and 2 that were dark blue like the sea. After using his spirit vision, a narrow scene appeared in Klein's normal vision. The firelight that entered the room illuminated the black stone tiles. On top of the tiles were piles of bones covered with rotten clothing, and a few of them emitted dark gold and dark blue light. Condensed Beyonder characteristics? Mystical items? As these thoughts flashed through his mind, Klein swept his gaze to the ends of the room. Along the dark wall stood a bifold door. A bloody pair of bifold doors. There seemed to remnants of fresh blood on the door. They continued sliding down as they reflected the light. Klein had wanted to let Miss Bodyguard scout the way ahead when he suddenly felt a change in Azek's copper whistle that he was holding in his hand. The originally cold and mild whistle suddenly became bone-piercing. It was a profound feeling of death. Klein narrowed his eyes and instinctively took a step back. Then, he noticed that his right forearm was numb and itchy and that it was beginning to swell. A scene flashed through his mind as he immediately took out a tarot card with his left hand and slashed across his arm. What surged out from his wound wasn't blood, but tiny black squirming worms. Sizzle. When these worms fell to the ground, they eroded into smoke. They struggled and huddled, but in the end, they melted under the glow of the lanterns. After a few seconds, all the black worms in Klein's wound finally flowed out, leaving only crimson liquid. He wriggled his muscles to control the small wound and prevented the blood from flowing further. Miss Bodyguard watched this scene quietly, her pretty eyebrows creasing into a rarely seen frown. Klein was just about to speak when he discovered the coldness and deadliness of Azek's copper whistle hadn't abated. At the same time, his gaze landed on Miss Bodyguard's shadow. She never had a shadow to begin with. Run! Klein shouted and immediately ran towards the hall. Miss Bodyguard quickly floated up, and the two of them saw the lantern light in front of them gradually being swallowed up by a black shadow. Tap! 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 Klein ran like a hurricane as fast as he could while the light around him faded away. Tap! 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 The shadow grew bigger and bigger, closer and closer, thicker and thicker. The light from the flame was about to be completely engulfed, and at that moment, the door was still a few meters away. At that moment, Klein instinctively rushed forward and then rolled across the stone door. The light from the fire suddenly brightened, and the uneasiness in his heart instantly disappeared. Azek's copper whistle also returned to its mild and cold state. Miss Bodyguard floated beside him as she turned around and looked at the passageway which had once again sunk into darkness. She said with an uncertain tone, "Evil spirit." Evil spirit? Klein almost drew a deep breath when he heard that. Fortunately, as a clown, he was good at controlling his expression and reactions. In the field of mysticism, evil spirits were extremely terrifying monsters. The best of them could even be said to be on the same level as high-sequence beyonders. An evil spirit is wandering within this ancient structure? For some reason, it's bound or imprisoned within that room. If it was an evil spirit, that explains why Mr. Azek's copper whistle responded. An evil spirit can be considered as an undead creature. Klein stood up and also looked at the path which was now submerged in darkness. He felt as if there was a pair of cold eyes staring at him. In the cold and gloomy hall, Klein suddenly shivered. He retracted his gaze and said to Miss Bodyguard, "Let's return." From the way Azek's copper whistle reacted, it's likely that the room contains a terrifying evil spirit. Its danger level is highly likely to be above that of Nimblewright Master Rosago and Rear Admiral Hurricane Kilongos. It's been roaming these confines for centuries to thousands of years. Perhaps it's already equivalent to a high-sequence Beyonder. If it wasn't for its experiencing difficulties in letting its powers escape the room, I would already be dead. Even if Miss Bodyguard is a powerful Sequence 5, there's no hope of us turning the tides of battle with our powers combined. One needs to be aware of one's strength. I cannot be enticed by the suspected Beyonder characteristics and mystical items left in there. Greed often leads to death. Klein silently came up with a reason to convince himself. Miss Bodyguard turned her head to look at him. Without much emotion in her eyes, she asked, "What happens next?" Next? Klein silently gritted his teeth and said with deliberation, "Let Millet Carter get the police. Who knows when this evil spirit will escape? It's best to finish it as soon as possible." "No, that won't work. Mr. Carter doesn't know enough. By informing the police this way, the police department won't pay enough attention to it. The first batch of people who come to explore this place will suffer heavy casualties, and they might even indirectly help the evil spirit escape from its restraints. Also, for me to see these statues, a detective like me might be silenced." "Ah, did you see the bones and spiritual light in the room?" Miss Bodyguard once again cast her gaze towards the dark path behind the ajar stone door, and very slightly nodded her head. Klein thought quickly and said, "My guess is that these are the corpses of the explorers from before. They were killed by the evil spirit in that room, and one of the Beyonders left behind some mystical items. This might have had something to do with the Viscount family that lived beyond this premises. I plan to inquire about their last names, go to the library, and look for information about their descendants. Perhaps, I might gain some valuable clues. After coming to a preliminary confirmation of the situation, I'll make a choice based on the severity of the situation. I might get some explosives, destroy the door, or send an anonymous letter to the police, detailing the existence of the evil spirit. However, I'll have to think of a way to avoid the risk ahead of time. This isn't too urgent. I can take my time." Miss Bodyguard quietly listened to what Klein had to say. Looking ahead, she said in an ethereal voice, "Are you not considering to get people to exorcise this evil spirit? Even if there were no mystical items left behind, the remains after the evil spirit dissipates are still precious enough. It's the first time I've seen you talk so much, probably." Klein replied without hesitation, "The risk is too high. I think my life and health are more important." He organized his words and added, "The most powerful person I know is you. And from your performance just now, you don't seem to be a match for that evil spirit. I can't imagine any other way of finishing it, other than calling the police." Miss Bodyguard turned around, her pale face somewhat translucent. "You still have some sense," she commented calmly, then drifted toward the exit of the ancient hall. "Other than being suspected to be under the true creator's influence, in what way do I look like a madman?" Klein silently lampooned. He held the lantern and cane and followed behind Miss Bodyguard. Throughout the entire process, he felt as if he was being watched by the cold eyes of the dark corridor. It was only when they walked out of the stone door that suffused an ancient aura did the feeling suddenly disappear. Klein turned around and closed the door, sealing the inverted candlesticks, scuffed marks, and the creepy statues of the six deities, allowing them to continue their thousand-year-long slumber in that unchanging darkness and silence. Patting the dust off his clothes, he switched the lantern in his other hand and hurried back to Millet Carter's basement. As for Miss Bodyguard, she had disappeared into thin air as usual. Millet Carter was pacing about in the basement. When he saw Klein exit, he hurriedly asked, "How is it?" What's the situation inside? Klein had long thought of an excuse as he said with an expression of fear, terrible, there are a lot of snakes in there, and many spots have collapsed. I plan to gather some information, gather some manpower, and once preparations are done, do another round of exploration. During this period of time, it's best that you don't send anyone in. Believe me, there are more venomous snakes in there than you can imagine. Millet drew a gasp and asked in fear, will they slither out? Do you know any experts that can deal with the snakes? Klein immediately nodded. I'll get people to help and try my best to deal with this matter. It's the cold autumn now, and the snakes aren't willing to move. As long as you don't send anyone to disturb them, nothing will happen. Okay, please hurry. I'll close this door and prevent anyone from entering. Hearing that, Millet relaxed a little. When Klein saw that his employer was truly intimidated by what he said, he quickly put down the lantern, nudged his gold-rimmed spectacles and said, next up, I'll gather some information. I'll first gain a preliminary understanding of the layout of the underground structure before I explore it again. That requires you to tell me which Viscount was the original owner of this house. Millet had bought this building precisely because it was an estate of a former noble, so he answered immediately, Viscount Pound. What do you know about him and his family? Klein asked in a professional manner. Millet pondered and said, not much. I only know that he won his aristocratic title in the Battle of the Violated Oath. It once enjoyed an illustrious period, but decades later, suddenly declined due to unknown reasons. The family kept losing its heirs, causing it to eventually have to seek out distant relatives to keep the aristocratic title. And the new Viscount Pound is, he squandered most of the family's fortune, and he was demoted to baronet by the king. He's probably still in Backland and can go bankrupt at any moment. Battle of the Violated Oath? The Battle of the Violated Oath that began in 738 during the Fifth Epoch? Having successfully graduated as a history student, Klein instinctively recalled the corresponding knowledge. The war that happened about 6 centuries ago was a war involving religion. The southern Fanapotter kingdom originally believed in both Mother Earth and the god of knowledge and wisdom, but due to some influencing factors, the two churches began to be at odds with each other, and their believers often clashed. During that period, its two neighbors in the north, the Loan Kingdom and the Intis Kingdom, seized the opportunity to start a war in the name of protecting freedom of religion. In the later stages of the war, the Fasak Empire joined the fray and attempted to destroy the ploy by Loan and Intis. However, they still failed to turn the situation around. The result of the war was that the border between Leon and Fanapotter, as well as Intis and Fanapotter, countries such as Lemberg, Mawson, and Seeger, gained independence. They mainly believed in the god of knowledge and wisdom, leaving the Church of Mother Earth as the only religion in the Fanapotter kingdom. The conflict that lasted 5 years was called the Battle of the Violated Oath because both sides of the war accused their adversaries of violating the Holy Oath at the end of the Fourth Epoch. After that, there was more than 300 years of peace in the northern continent. This didn't mean that there was no conflict between nations, but rather, there were no wars on that scale again. It lasted until Russell invented the steam engine and improved the sailboats and artillery. This is the information recorded in the history textbooks. Thinking about it now, since it involved faith, there must have been some Beyonders from the church involved. There must have been an intense Beyonder war. However, it's said that that era was a period with few Beyonders. Squadron battles? Could the Pound family's sudden waning and continuous loss of heirs, which happened decades ago, have something to do with the discovery of the ancient structure underground? Klein thoughtfully asked, do you know where Baronet Pound currently lives? I'm sorry, I don't know. Millet shook his head slightly. Klein asked a few more questions, but seeing that he couldn't get any more information, he bade farewell and returned to 15 Minsk Street. It was almost 5 in the afternoon and the sky was as dark as the night. Klein thought that the public libraries would have been closed by then, so he temporarily put aside the underground structure and prepared dinner for himself. He had wanted to learn to make Fanapotter noodles based on a recipe in the newspapers, but he ended up with noodles mixed in meat, sauce, and vegetables. To his surprise, it tasted pretty good. After having had his fill, Klein tossed a coin casually, divining if he should inform the police. He received a negative answer. Ellipsis. The Backland evening was as serene as other cities, at least in Sherwood Borough. Klein was sleeping soundly, wandering through different dreams in an adrift manner when he suddenly realized, with a jolt, that he was dreaming. Someone is invading my dreams? Klein resisted the urge to frown and pretended to look around in confusion. He found himself in a scorching yellow desert. A roar suddenly came from the sky, and a huge monster dyed in black and gold flew over. The creature had a thick, lizard-like body and a pair of wide wings covered in a hide on its back. It descended and blotted out the sun in the sky. A dragon. A powerful dragon. Klein saw scales the size of a plate, a gaping mouth that emitted pure light, and two dark golden vertical pupils. Roar! The dragon spat out a beam of light that seemed to envelop everything. Soon, large swaths of the desert was obliterated. Amid the light, a figure jumped into the air. He was 3 or 4 meters tall, but he didn't have the unique vertical eye of the giants. He had a handsome, young face, and he wore black full-body armor which seemed to be spattered with blood. This giant knight swung his broadsword upwards and countless bluish-white flames, which appeared a little purple, condensed into long spears. They shot at the dragon. It was as if he had an entire army of illusory beyonders helping him in battle. In the midst of the meteor shower, the giant knight leapt onto the head of the dragon, and he swung his sword down. The afterimages he had created earlier instantly overlapped, and the sword rays turned into intersecting lightning. Pow! The ground shook wildly, and the dragon fell, splattering its dark gold blood. At that moment, the scene changed to a huge bloody door. It was the same bloody door that Klein had seen in the ancient structure that very afternoon. With a creak, the bloody door opened a crack, allowing him to catch a glimpse of a black high-back chair. A man of normal height sat on the high-back chair. He had his head lowered, silent and deathly still. As his vision got closer and closer, Klein saw the man's clothes clearly. He seemed to be the knight that had just killed the dragon, and he was still wearing the black armor that was stained with blood. The only difference was that he was no longer 3 or 4 meters tall. At this moment, the man suddenly raised his head. His handsome, young face had terrifying signs of decay, his eyes ice-cold and emotionless. Klein jumped in fright and awoke from his dream. Opening his eyes, he saw the crimson moonlight shining through the curtains. Under the dim crimson moonlight, Klein pulled back his blanket and got up. For a seer, putting weight on dreams was a basic requirement, and the dream he just had could never be dismissed as a simple nightmare. Dressed in relatively comfortable clothes, he came before the full-body mirror and said in a low voice, "I dreamed of the blood-stained door in that room." Miss Bodyguard's figure slowly outlined itself above the mirror. She replied expressionlessly, "The influence of the evil spirit's aura. It will gradually weaken until it disappears." "Is that so?" Klein nodded slightly and returned to the side of the bed. He picked up the gold pocket watch and popped it open. Seeing that it was still early, he lay back down to sleep. This time, he no longer encountered the same dream as before. Sunday morning the next day, in high spirits, Klein made himself a soft-boiled egg to go with buttered bread. In the Lowen Kingdom, or rather in the countries of the northern continent, it was a must for gentlemen to read the newspapers at breakfast, and Klein was no exception. He opened up the newspapers he subscribed to, the Tussock Times, Backland Morning Post, and Backland Bulletin. The Civil Servant Unified Examination Bill has been officially passed by the House of Lords. The first examination will be held in early December, and the second examination will be held at the end of January next year. The final interview will be held 2 weeks after that. Within a week, the government will announce the positions and requirements involved in this exam and begin the registration process. Reporters surmise that most of it will be held in Backland. Klein scanned the contents, picked up his cup, and sipped his sea black tea. He couldn't help but think of Benson and thought to himself, the bill is passed at the end of September. The positions will be announced in the beginning of October, and registrations will be completed by early November. The examinations will start at the beginning of December. The timing is tight and very unreasonable. That implies how much a rush the king and the prime minister is in to have this enacted. But that's advantageous for Benson. He prepared 2 months ahead of everyone else. Even if he can't compare to the elite graduates of the universities, he would definitely be able to beat most of his competition, and the positions the elites are aiming for wouldn't clash with his. He should be fine. Klein wanted to tap his chest 4 times to draw out a crimson moon and say, "May the goddess bless him," but then he remembered that Miss Bodyguard was nearby and resisted the urge. After all, he had claimed to be a believer of the god of steam and machinery. After finishing his last mouthful of bread, he continued reading the papers. Both houses have passed the National Atmospheric Pollution Council bill, allowing the government to set up such an organization. The coming month will be a critical period for the various parties to become a member of the council. An independent alkali industry public prosecutor has been approved with the goal of minimizing the pollution levels in acid and alkali factories. Quote ellipsis. The fifth page doesn't have an advertisement for the purchase of goods from the Ernst firm. There's no need to consider participating in the Beyonder gathering tomorrow night. Tingen City, 2 Daffodil Street. Benson read and reread the news in the papers, forgetting the bread on his plate. The Civil Servant Unified Examination Bill was passed? Dressed in a long, black dress, Melissa looked at her brother who was acting oddly. The newspapers from the past few days had been playing up the bill that would be passed this time. Benson finally put down the newspaper, wiped his black hair, and exhaled slowly. Yes. At this moment, the two of them suddenly fell into silence. The room was completely silent, it even lacked the sound of knives and forks colliding with the dining plates. The indescribable atmosphere was broken by Bella, the maid who came out of the kitchen. Benson smiled and said, "This is foreseeable. Actually, the most important thing is the previous piece of news." Oh? Melissa's expression was unusually quiet. Benson took a bite of his bread and smiled. The news that the Backland Polytechnic will be restructured into a university. It'll formally accept students next year. It won't need tests on grammar and classical literature, but will instead focus on the technical aspects. It's very suitable for graduates and students of technical schools everywhere. Melissa, I think you can try. But, Melissa subconsciously retorted. Benson interrupted her with a smile. Its tuition will be half as cheap as the Tingen, Perth, Cabot, and Backland and the other universities. It's equivalent to the Constant Industry University in Midseashire, and there will be even more opportunities for scholarships. Melissa, don't you like machinery, steam, and this stuff? This is the best opportunity for you to have access to much advanced and deeper knowledge. Give it a try, how about it? Don't worry about wasting money. Although that money can allow us to maintain our present lives without working, we're still young. We must not define our lives like this. As you can see, compared to a few months ago, my grammar has improved a lot. It might be better if we change environments. I know you can't bear to part with Tingen and this place. Well, we'll come back eventually, but not when we're young. Melissa looked at the various components on the tea table as her lips moved a few times and she said, "What about Bella?" After Klein's death, she didn't want to hire any more maidservants, but when she thought of how tragic Bella's life would be after she lost her job, she gave up on the idea. After all, the extra expense of 5 soldi a week was already nothing to the Moretti family, which had an annuity of at least £300. To this, Benson shook his head and laughed. There are still a few more months before that happens. We can let Bella find a new job ahead of time. Before that, we will continue to pay her and provide her with a bedroom. Furthermore, her cooking skills are much better than before, so she can apply to be a chef at someone's home. It's a pity. Heh heh. Of course, everything depends on the premise that you can pass the entrance exams at Backland's University of Technology. He had wanted to say that it was a pity that Bella didn't have much time to learn how to cook, but after looking at Melissa's gloomy expression, he forcefully changed the topic. Before Melissa could say anything, Benson smiled and touched his hair. I'm planning on resigning tomorrow and will focus on preparing for the exam. Most of the positions are said to be in Backland. That's my goal. I hope we can go there together. Melissa was silent for a moment before she slowly nodded her head. At the same time, she put down her fork and knife, wiped her mouth with a napkin, and said, "I'm going to the bathroom." All right. Benson watched his sister leave the dining table, and the smile that had been plastered over his face rapidly vanished. He took out the silver pocket watch with the vineleaf patterns, took a close look at it, and sighed very quietly. During the whole of Sunday, Klein busied himself with the public libraries in the Sherwood borough in search of information related to Viscount Pound, but the Viscount's family didn't have a single biography, nor did it arouse the interest of any historian to conduct a special study. They were scattered across the annals of history, and Klein, who had no search function to use, felt a throbbing pain in his head as he faced the vast collection of books and essays. He spent 6 hours browsing through a lot of information, but failed to find any useful information. I have to find someone who has a deep knowledge of the history of the nobility. Or I have to bribe someone in the police department to get the address of Baronet Pound. He's an aristocrat, and the police department must have a corresponding record, and there aren't many aristocrats. When Klein got home, he stood in front of the mirror and talked to the air. The surface of the mirror quickly outlined Miss Bodyguard's Gothic regal dress and the black bonnet on her head. She nodded slightly, as if agreeing with Klein. She then suddenly spoke out in a dreamy voice, "The employment period is over." "I know, the 3 days are up." Klein thought for a moment and asked, "If I can obtain some clues about the Pound family, would you like to know?" Miss Bodyguard didn't answer but gave a slight nod. Through Marich? Klein asked. After nodding her head again, Miss Bodyguard bent down, lifted up her skirt, and bowed. Her figure quickly disappeared, and the reflection in the mirror was no longer anything special. Klein looked around and didn't relax as a result of that. He proceeded systematically to prepare dinner and fill his stomach. He waited until it was late in the night before returning to his bedroom and drew back the curtains. Then, he took out the iron cigarette case and reached out to touch Rosago's all-black eye. A series of illusory roars immediately rampaged through his mind, seeming to tear apart his mind and destroy his thoughts. With great difficulty, Klein resisted the pain which was making his head explode. Once again, he saw the black threads spreading out from different parts of his body. They were densely packed and illusory, reaching out endlessly. He quickly released his grip to escape from the negative influence. After nearly a minute, everything returned to normal. Phew, I can finally go up to the gray fog and verify the spiritual perception I had before. Klein silently said to himself as he quickly set up the ritual, summoned himself, and responded to himself. Then, in his spirit form, he carried Azek's copper whistle, picked up the iron cigarette case, and returned above the gray fog. Klein sat at seat of honor at the ancient long table, using his fingers to create spiritual flames and burning the bloodstained documents in the corner and any other items that were no longer needed. When he was done, he opened the iron cigarette case and was surprised to find that the all-black eye had become silent, no longer showing any signs of madness, but that corruptive influence was still settling within. It just wasn't active, as if it was in hibernation. As expected, it's impossible to separate them directly. Klein muttered. Following that, on the other side of the ancient table, a man in a hooded robe appeared. Just like his previous attempt to create a clone, this man was stiff and lifeless. It was obvious that he wasn't someone real at a glance. There was no way he could deceive the members of the Tarot Club. However, Klein already had an idea regarding this. He extended his hand and held the all-black eye. There was silence in his ears, and there were no longer any terrifying howls. Using the amassed Beyander characteristic, he could see that there were also black threads floating out from the fake body opposite him. Soon after, Klein carefully let his spirituality spread out through the all-black eye, touching a few of the illusory threads. All of a sudden, he felt like he was holding onto something. With a thought from him, the fake person raised his hand. It worked. I can use the ability of the Nimblewright Master to create a fake Tarot Club member. However, this is draining on me. I'm unable to maintain a second one. The symbol on the back of the chair won't change accordingly, but it's not like Miss Justice and the rest can see it. Klein happily practiced, over and over again, even learning how to manipulate his clone's throat and mouth to let him speak. When his spirituality was almost exhausted, he smiled and said to the fake person in front of him, "Welcome, new member. Which tarot card do you wish to draw?" After saying that, he closed his mouth. The fake person opposite him lifted his hand to stroke his chin as he laughed hoarsely. "World. I choose the card, the World." If the Fool signified the beginning of the Tarot Club, then the World signified the end, a perfect ending of a cycle and sublimation. Klein had named his Smurf the World, because he hoped that it would lead to a beautiful beginning and end. In the future, I'll be able to make the world make requests or do things that wouldn't be convenient for me. This will greatly reduce the possibility that my image as Mr. Fool will collapse. With an alt, no, a Smurf truly is what makes life complete. Klein sighed in relief and waved the world away. Following that, he spread out his spirituality, wrapped himself, and stimulated a descent into the gray fog and returned to the real world. He had left Rosago's all-black eye above the gray fog. After all, he couldn't usually use the item, anyway, and he had to constantly worry about having it discovered by others or losing it. After putting away the summoning ritual materials, Klein looked up towards the crimson moonlight that passed through the curtains, filled with anticipation for tomorrow's gathering. When it came to understanding the aristocracy, he believed that Miss Justice would definitely surpass 99% of the people of Leon. And with his Smurf, the World, he could directly ask her about the Pound family without worrying about affecting his image as the Fool. Of course, this had to be done in a more tactful manner. After all, Detective Sherlock Moriarty was also looking for information on the Pound family, and only with enough information would he be able to perform a divination above the grey fog. Phew, Klein thought hard for a while before he relaxed and fell asleep. After entering the grey fog, it was as though the remnants of the evil spirit's aura had completely disappeared. Klein slept until dawn, but he didn't see the sun because of the thin fog outside. He continued as planned, heading to the rest of the public libraries in Backland, but he no longer queried the librarians nor did he mention the Pound family. He only leafed through the materials concerning the nobility by himself. At 20 minutes to 3 in the afternoon, Klein entered the mysterious space above the grey fog ahead of time. Inside the vast and ancient palace, he sat down at the seat belonging to the Fool. He conjured the fake world on the opposite side of the mottled bronze table as he familiarized himself with operating the world. After a few minutes, Klein took out his pocket watch and glanced at it, sending a message to the crimson star that symbolized the sun to prepare for the gathering. While he waited, he played with the all-black eye and fitted it with a silver chain. Then, he wound it around his right wrist and covered it with his sleeve. At 3 in the afternoon, rays of light shot out from the palace that resembled a giant's residence. Justice, the Hanged Man, and the sun, each projected a blurry silhouette dyed in crimson. Good afternoon, Mr. Fool. Good afternoon. Audrey was about to greet every member of the Tarot Club when her gaze suddenly fell upon the figure seated at the very end. It was a stranger wearing a hooded black robe. He was also illusory and hazy. This is? Audrey looked at Mr. Fool with both puzzlement and delight. Has the Tarot Club grown bigger again? Is it Furs or Zio? No, the height doesn't match. Is it someone else? While Audrey was deep in thought, Klein leisurely leaned back and said, "This is a new member, Mr. World." At the same time, through his grey fog-augmented spirit vision, he discovered that the surface color of the sun's astral projection had become a little purer, but it had yet to reach the standards of Sequence 8. His initial judgment was that the sun had completely digested the Bard potion. "Hello," Audrey greeted politely, curiously scrutinizing the new member. She quickly read some of the corresponding details through the hazy fog. Mr. World is a person who is reserved. He seldom moves and always wears a straight face. I wonder where he's from. Lowen? Intis? Or a place as mysterious as the City of Silver? Audrey nodded thoughtfully. After so many gatherings, she had deduced one thing from the fact that the sun couldn't engage in their conversations. That was, that he was most likely not speaking the Lowen language and that the information that he heard was most likely translated by Mr. Fool. After the Hanged Man, Alger, and the sun, Derek, greeted the world respectively, to which the newcomer gave a rather cold response, Klein looked at Justice and said, "The 2 candidates you have nominated are still under examination. I'll give you a simple task. You can entrust it to them in your name. This is part of the examination. It should be this strict." Not only was Audrey not disappointed, she even felt that it was only necessary. The members of the Tarot Club must be strictly selected. Not just anyone can become one. She thought proudly before adding in a somewhat guilty tone, "And for me to be pulled in by Mr. Fool at the very beginning shows that I was lucky, and luck is a unique quality as well." "All right, please issue the mission." Audrey gave an affirmative answer. Klein stretched out his right hand and placed it on the table, showing a picture of Lenivus and his dressing. "Investigate the man in the painting. He's in Backland." Klein had the portrait appear in front of Miss Justice. Audrey looked over and saw a young man with neatly combed black hair and round glasses. He had a full forehead. It was a colored oil painting, with taunting brown eyes that seemed abnormally protruded, and at the bottom were the words, formerly known alias, Lenivus, and other information. It's a simple mission, which means that the target isn't strong. However, there must be something special about him that makes Mr. Fool aware of his existence. Although it's a simple mission, there might be a deeper purpose behind it. For someone as powerful as him, it shouldn't just be a test. Audrey momentarily allowed her to throng her mind. Only after a few seconds did she say, "I'll entrust it to them." The 2 ladies seem to have many connections in Backland which would serve to help in finding Lenivus. After confirming the matters pertaining to his revenge, Klein fell silent, and he deliberately allowed his Smurf to take center stage. The world surveyed the area and spoke with a hoarse voice. "Mr. Fool told me that I can issue missions and gather ingredients here, is that so?" "Yes," Audrey elegantly nodded and said. "However, you need to wait patiently. What's going to happen next is Mr. Fool's reading time. I completed my mission to assassinate Intis Ambassador Bakerland, but I didn't even mention it to occupy this period of time," she thought, raising her chin slightly. "Miss Justice, you really have a great sense of mastership. I'll have to pay the price of knowledge later so that the assassination of Bakerland can truly come to an end." Klein looked away, amused, and looked over at the Hanged Man. Alger Wilson didn't speak blindly because of the appearance of a new member. He remained silent and observed in secret. At this moment, when he saw Mr. Fool looking at him, he quickly and humbly bowed and said, This time, there are still 6 pages. The final page will be given to you next time. Sure. Klein nodded. The hanged man quickly focused his mind, recalled the contents, and expressed them with his mind. He quickly finished writing 6 pages of the diary and saw them suddenly vanish and appear in Klein's hands. Klein looked down and swept through the contents of the first page. The 9th of February. I have a third child. I named him Bornova. My eldest daughter, Bernadette, was lucky. Her mother and I were just low-sequence Beyonders back then. She is free to choose the path she wants to take. My eldest son, Seal, is the most unfortunate. He inherited a minute amount of Beyonder characteristics, but he has to follow my path. Perhaps he could make changes at sequence 4, but attaining high sequences are never easy. My second son, Bornova, was born between Bernadette and Seal. I have his characteristics equivalent to a sequence 5 Beyonder. This has reduced the burden on me, allowing me to digest my potion even faster, accelerating my advancement. And when he was just born, he was already showing various traits of an astromancer. Zaradul came to congratulate me in secret and praised Bornova as a lovely angel. I asked this master of divination what he would accomplish in the future. He only smiled and didn't answer me. When I asked him about Ciel's future, he finally said that death is an inevitable ending, but that might be a good thing. Seriously, a seer's words are always so vague that it makes one want to pry their mouths open. When I finally asked about Bernadette's future, he suddenly became very serious. He said she would hate me, detest me, turn her back on me, and she would become an important figure in the mysterious world. Sometimes, you really shouldn't ask about the result of a divination. I find it hard to believe that my adorable and kind Bernadette, who cares for her brother, adores her father, and pampers her mother, would hate me and betray me. Why would that happen? What excessive act did I do? Maybe she'll have someone she loves but I'm not satisfied with. Some punk that I'll end up killing? No, Zaradul isn't a soothsayer, and the divination he receives might be wrong. Forget it, Rizal. I think I smell the scent of some contrived family melodrama. After reading the first page of the diary, Klein couldn't help but lampoon silently. At the same time, he naturally recalled what Zaradul had told him about the future of Bernadette, an important figure in the mysterious world. Was this referring to the world of the Beyonders? What level would someone be deemed an important figure? Klein turned the pages thoughtfully. The 22nd of May. Florin of the Sauron family actually wants me to be his subordinate. Do I look like someone who would be a lackey? His attitude is simply unacceptable. I swear that I'll one day make him pay the price for his arrogance today. However, some of the things he mentioned are very interesting and worth pondering over. Florin said that the history of the Sauron family exceeds 2,000 years, making it longer than even the Church of the God of Craftsmanship's history. They witnessed all the cooperation and strife, light and darkness, in the fourth epoch, and they have survived until this very day. Other than the Augustus family of Loen, the Einhorn family of Fasak, and the Castia family of Fainapotter, the other powerful families that have been deemed their equal, such as the Antigonus family and the Zaradul family, have been relegated as vestiges of history, or have turned to nothing but rats in the sewers, hiding from the public as shady existences. He said that making me his subordinate, a subordinate of the ancient and glorious Sauron family, is a gift to me. Back then, I wanted to FK all 8 generations of his ancestors. However, for the Sauron family to have a history exceeding 2,000 years is indeed surprising. The fourth epoch is known as the Epoch of the Gods. Be it the 7 orthodox deities of the present times, or Death, Primordial Demoness, Dark Side of the Universe, and the True Creator, they all remained active in the real world. Legend had it that they frequently did miracles. For the Sauron family to last to this day and enjoy its current high standing, it's definitely not an easy matter. Their long history has given them far more than just arrogance. They must be hiding many secrets, and perhaps even extremely terrifying sealed artifacts. They are truly a colossus that stands tall above the earth, one that people can't look straight at. Upon reading this, Klein had a lot of ideas. For Rizal to be able to overthrow the rule of the Sauron family, he must have experienced a horrifying and heart-stirring struggle. Even if the Sauron family didn't have a Grade 0 sealed artifacts, they definitely had no lack of Grade 1 sealed artifacts. Adding to the possibility of having high-sequence Beyonders, even if the Church of the God of Steam and Machinery fully supported Rizal, it's unlikely that any good outcome might come out of it. Could it be that before all of that happened, the Sauron family was already beginning to wane and weaken, and the Intis revolution was just an external manifestation of this state? What did they experience during that period of time? Did they lose sealed artifacts? Did the high-sequence Beyonders die? Did that attract the attention of many ambitious people? Judging from this diary, the Augustus family of Lowen is no stranger to the Antigonus and Zaradel families. Internally, they should have corresponding records. The Sun had previously mentioned that the City of Silver has endured for more than 2,500 years in the Dark Ages. According to my initial judgment, that's the date of the Cataclysm. In the past 200 years, the Sauron family claim to have a history spanning more than 2,000 years. I wonder if it will extend to the point before the City of Silver. I'll try to find an opportunity to mention the Sauron clan and see the Sun's reaction. If the Sun still has a look of stupefaction, it would indirectly mean that the Sauron family only rose up after the Cataclysm. Perhaps they had benefited greatly from the Cataclysm to become nobles in the Fourth Epoch, and royalty in the Fifth Epoch. Well, even if the Sun doesn't know, it doesn't prove it completely. Perhaps he didn't learn his history well. When Klein turned to the third page, he found that the content should have been written in the early days of Russel's appointment as consul of the Intis Republic. From the diary entries on this page, it can be seen that Russell had developed and promulgated a new civil code which encouraged inventions, protected trade, and the incubation of the Industrial Revolution. It wasn't him merely satisfying his own warped humor of acting as this world's Napoleon and his ambition to change the world. What he did allowed him to reconcile with the Church of the Eternal Blazing Sun. The Eternal Blazing Sun was also the god of deeds, the guardian of businesses. The closer to the times the civil code was and the more prosperous trade was made it more in line with the needs of the Church. Judging from this part of the diary, the relationship between Russell and the Church of the Eternal Blazing Sun was gradually thawing and beginning to improve. When he brazenly claimed the title of emperor more than 10 years later and called himself Caesar, it's likely that he obtained the simultaneous endorsement of the two churches. Otherwise, it would have been too risky. Then, what resulted in his assassination? Klein cast his gaze at the fourth page in puzzlement. The 11th of August. That retard Florin is showing off again. He said that he's the most promising member of the Sauron family generation to become a high-sequence Beyonder because he's very similar to his great-great-grandfather. Is there any necessary connection? I looked him up and down, left and right, but I couldn't find any sign of talent. Moreover, in the field of Beyonders, is talent important? Well, figuring out the essence to acting can be a core element of talent, but that's not necessary. As long as one knows the acting method and not be stupid enough to misunderstand the meaning, or avoid doing things that easily result in a loss of control, then one has a chance to completely digest the potions. Which is to say, just a bit more time and effort needs to be spent. In one's lifetime, it's not impossible to become a high-sequence Beyonder. The main obstacle to becoming a high-sequence Beyonder is the difficulty of obtaining Beyonder ingredients and the difficulty of corresponding rituals. Of course, I have to admit that those born as Beyonders have more time to prepare. Was Florin's great-great-grandfather a high-sequence Beyonder? Does looking like him imply talent? It can be seen that at the time of writing this diary entry, Russell was still very young and that he wasn't aware of the two laws of Beyonder characteristics: indestructibility and conservation. Klein nodded indiscernibly. With his current knowledge, he could probably understand the hidden meaning behind Florin Sorin's words. A high-sequence Beyonder's Beyonder characteristic remains contained a spirit mark. This was also one of the reasons why it was easy for people to lose control when concocting potions with this ingredient. And people who resembled the original owner could avoid this negative influence to the greatest extent. Their chances of success were higher than the average person, so they were considered gifted. How holy artifacts recognized their masters probably shared the same conditions. This achieves the same goal via different approaches as the acting method, but it can't be popularized. Once the advancement is successful, one would still have to do the acting method required of the potion to completely digest its characteristics. While in deep thought, Klein glanced at the two diary entries at the back of the page and discovered how much Emperor Russell enjoyed the liberalness in Intis, but he was worried that his future wife would be equally liberal. With the paper making some noise, Klein placed the fifth page at the top. The 20th of April. I participated in that ancient organization's secret gathering once again. Those members still leave me shaking. It's hard to believe that they're actually all members of this organization. This time, I learned some of the ancient organization's philosophy. They believe that people will always lose some of their individuality bit by bit until they sleep. Hence, by trying hard to observe and remember oneself, one can use the various types of information to achieve the purification needed to face the final end of days. They've kept and passed down secrets for thousands or even tens of thousands of years. They believe that dusk is inevitable, and that doomsday cannot be avoided. They believe in the original creator and believe that he is not truly dead. When dusk comes and everything ends, he will wake up from his slumber and let everything return to him. He will create a new world, a new history. All of the actions from this organization stem from this belief. It can be said that they show great animosity to the true creator. They aren't stingy with their descriptions to describe him as fallen and evil. They wield the second blasphemy slate and the 22 paths of the divine, but they only allow members to choose a few of them, with the exception of those who were already Beyonders when they joined. Are there any secrets to these pathways? I'll first jot it down and analyze it in the future. These pathways are Bard, Sailor, Reader, and Spectator. Haha, I have to change my habits of calling these sequence pathways in the future. Using those names in that ancient organization makes me appear quite uneducated. This is very similar to what I've analyzed from my hostile relations and from Mr. A's request, with it being very similar to how the Bard, Sailor, Reader, and Secrets Suppliant pathways can be exchanged at Sequence 4. Is Manipulator a high sequence of the Spectator pathway? Why do many secret organizations declare that the apocalypse would definitely befall us one day? For example, the Demonist sect, this ancient organization, and they themselves do not rely on this to proselytize. Is it a requirement for brainwashing, or would there really be a so-called dusk? Klein thought of many things, but due to a lack of information, he was unable to come to a definite answer. At the same time, he couldn't help but silently lampoon, Russell, can't you just write down the name of that organization? Resisting the changes in his expression and body movements, Klein turned to the last page, which had relatively little content, and read. The 1st of January. A beginning of a new year. I happened to finish my first card of blasphemy. I will hide the ultimate secret of the 22 paths of the divine in these different cards of blasphemy and scatter them across the world. If things fail, they'll be the best insurance that my children can fall back onto. Haha, I'll disrupt the order they wish to have and spread the profound mysteries of the divine. These cards of blasphemy will possess characteristics of being anti-divination and anti-prophecy. Apart from the ones I'm giving my children, the fated ones will receive it. I'm a person who makes sure to square accounts when it comes to grudges, and after I die, who cares if floods deluge the heavens? Oh, I didn't create that sentence. In short, the more chaotic the world is, the better it is. I have to consider how to name the cards of blasphemy that will form a set. The Paths of the Divine number 22. The major arcana tarot cards also have 22 cards. They can match quite well, but there are a few that don't meet the requirements. I need to make some changes to match the original potion names. That ancient organization is my last and biggest insurance. I don't know if they'll support me, or the manner in which they'll support me in. I still remember the shock when I first saw the blasphemy slate. So it turns out that the Beyonder pathways are paths of the divine. It really is true that the blasphemy slate is blaspheming the deities. Above every pathway's sequence 1, there is still a sequence 0. And there's a corresponding potion and ritual. Each pathway has a sequence 0. And sequence 0 is the sequence of a true God. For example, sequence 0, Sun. Sequence 0? There's still a sequence 0 above sequence 1? Sequence 0 is equivalent to a true God? There can only be one sequence 0 per pathway? Is this the true meaning of the paths of the divine? As long as one consumes the corresponding potion, does a ritual, and grasps the acting method to digest the Beyonder characteristic, an ordinary person can become a god one step at a time? This is truly blasphemous. Could the main ingredients of the final potion be the godhood, divine blood, and body of the eternal blazing sun? Ellipsis. The information on the diary's last page was filled with so much information that Klein almost couldn't think. He almost made additional body movements. The 22 paths of the divine correspond to the 22 sequence zeros. Sequence 0, Sun does sound very powerful. Perhaps there's a sequence 0, Death? I wonder what the names corresponding to the goddess and the lord of the storms are. According to Emperor Russell's description, some of these cards are identical to the major arcana tarot cards, but some of them are different. The cards of blasphemy he created were standardized with the names of the potions. These can no longer be called potions. Could the reason that the Emperor regretted not choosing the Seer, Apprentice, Marauder pathways be because their corresponding sequence zeros have yet to appear? Then what was the reason for the sudden personification of the hidden sage who was symbolically a deity? What was Russell plotting in the end? It feels like he became the enemy of everyone in the world, and that only seems possible if it was set into motion by that mysterious and ancient organization. The Primordial Demoness is the name of Sequence Zero for the Demoness pathway? Klein gradually found his train of thought, and he restrained the turmoil that was going through his mind. He knew that he couldn't lose himself in this matter. He had to recover as quickly as possible. Otherwise, Justice and the Hanged Man would discover something amiss and find it odd. Mr. Fool has been reading that page too long. I really want to obtain one of the cards of blasphemy that Emperor Roussel created. I want to know what else there is, other than the godhood providing potion formulas and the corresponding rituals. Klein suppressed his shock and puzzlement and made Roussel's diary disappear from his hands. He rapped the corner of the bronze table and looked to the side. Miss Justice, well done. You finished Bakerland in less than a week. According to the agreement, what kind of payment do you want? Bakerland is dead? That fast? Alger had left the islands in the past few days and hadn't received the appropriate information. He was astonished for a moment, which made Audrey, who was secretly observing him, feel delighted. Even if Alger was in the capital of the Rorstad archipelago, the city of generosity, Bayam, he might not have been informed in a timely fashion. After all, cable telegraph could only transmit limited information. Unless it was particularly urgent or important, there was always a delay of a few days. Sometimes, it would even take the colonists of the Rorstad archipelago a month or two to get an update on the latest situation in the northern continent. Restraining his thoughts, the Hanged Man looked at Mr. Fool in the thick fog and respectfully said with a hint of humility, I'm very sorry. I just managed to contact someone and couldn't help. This is a commission, not a help request. Don't worry about it. Klein chuckled. He turned his gaze back to Miss Justice, waiting for her to say what she wanted in return. May the goddess bless me. Please don't let Miss Justice's request be too difficult. It's best if I can repay her with knowledge. I've learned quite a lot of amazing things from Roussel's diary. Klein silently prayed to the goddess. Of course, he was very clear that with the grey fog separating them, the Evernight goddess definitely wouldn't be able to hear his prayers. Audrey's eyes darted around as she thought for a few seconds. Be honest and not greedy, Audrey, and stick to your principles. She gave a faint smile and said, No, I'm actually the one still owing you. No, I owe your adorer the bounty. Rear Admiral Keelingos's bounty was worth a total of £30,000. I should give your adorer £15,000. Killing Bakerland cost £10,000, so I still need to pay an additional £5,000. However, due to the matter with Bakerland, my finances are recently quite tight. I can only pay this bounty in a few months. Mr. Fool, is that all right? After she finished speaking, Audrey quietly exhaled. She felt that the little stone pressing against her heart was finally gone. Although discussing money and calculating the payment in front of Mr. Fool feels somewhat inappropriate, I can't hide the rewards I received from his adorer. Audrey sighed silently. As for the huge plantation worth more than £8,000, it was a private form of gratitude from Duke Negan and not a bounty. £5,000? I can get another £5,000? Keelingos's total bounty actually reached £30,000. Klein was startled. Immediately, he fell into an intense mental struggle. I'm supposed to pay this bounty to Mr. Azek, but I won't be able to get in touch with him for a long time. Putting the money aside would be a waste. I might as well use this money to enhance myself. When the time comes, I'll repay him by providing help. Klein made up his mind 3 seconds later as he lightly nodded at Miss Justice. Sure. Upon hearing Mr. Fool's response, Audrey's graceful seating posture remained the same, but her heart was completely relaxed. At that moment, Klein leaned back in his chair and fell silent. Then, he manipulated his smurf secretly from a commandeering position. The world coughed and said, Can I speak now? Audrey looked at Mr. Fool and seeing that he didn't say a thing, she nodded slightly and said, Sure. At the same time, she once again did a read on the new member, the world, and made a judgment. When I mentioned that the assassination of Ambassador Bakerland was a result of my commissioning, he didn't show any shock or surprise. He either doesn't know the importance of the matter, not understanding the importance of an ambassador, or he's someone who can keep his calm and is good at hiding his emotions and bodily movements. The way he mouths his words doesn't match what he says. It should have been translated by Mr. Fool as well, which makes it impossible for me to get his original vocal tics, or know what language he usually uses. Thoughts flashed through Audrey's mind before Mr. World's hoarse voice sounded. I wish to obtain the true root of a mist Trent, at least 60 milliliters of its juice, as well as the spring of the elves' marrow crystals and the complete spinal fluid of a dark patterned black panther. Which one of you can provide it, or provide any relevant clues? What do you wish to exchange them for? Klein added the Beyonder ingredient needed by the apothecary to his commission so that the Tarot Club members wouldn't be able to guess the main ingredients of the formula he wanted. Before Justice and the Hanged Man could react, the son, who had been silent the entire time, finally opened his mouth and said, "I know where Miss Triance are and I can help you obtain the materials. However, I must wait until I finish my advancement and have sufficient strength to join the corresponding patrol team." Recently, he had been accumulating merit points and rewards. He was working hard to obtain the main ingredients for the light supplement through the City of Silver's officials and private markets. He was still lacking quite a bit, as expected of the dangerous City of Silver with its numerous monsters. Klein silently commented in admiration, allowing the world to ask, "Then what do you wish to receive in exchange?" Without hesitation, Derek replied, "A weapon that suits me and can increase my combat strength." The reason why he didn't mention the corresponding ingredients for light supplement was because City of Silver had them all. They could be obtained through his own hard work. Upon hearing this request, Klein immediately thought of the inscribed steel sword that had appeared at the Beyonder gathering organized by the elderly gentleman, Eye of Wisdom. It was sharp enough, had the effect of exorcism and purification, and could be used for 3 years. It was valued at £500, perfectly matching the son's described requirements. "Why didn't you say so earlier? It has already been bought by someone else." Klein silently stared at the members, while the world nodded and said, "I will find a weapon that meets your requirements as soon as possible." "Is this transaction to be witnessed by Mr. Fool?" Klein nodded slightly to express his agreement. At that moment, Audrey shot a glance at the son and warned him. Apart from the Miss Triance juice, Mr. World's requested ingredients correspond to a sequence 7. The rough price is about £500 to £700. She felt that the son was too naive and was worried that he would be cheated by the unreadable Mr. World with cheap weapons. Although Mr. Fool is impartial and advocates fair equal exchange, it's not his place to stop it if both sides agree. After all, some items are of low value, but there are people who are in urgent need, so adding a premium to the price is very normal. Audrey thought to herself. A sequence 7 formula is about £800, Alger added. He had an instinctive aversion towards new members. Klein translated with great difficulty, for he didn't know what the currency unit of the pound corresponded to in the City of Silver, and could only use a Series 9 potion formula as a unit. "I understand." Derek slightly nodded, and then quietly added, "Thank you." The world maintained his silent and staid temperament and didn't comment on what had just happened. He turned to Justice and the Hanged Man, waiting for their response. Audrey thought for a few seconds and said, "Potion formula for psychiatrist and their corresponding Beyonder ingredients." "Ah, that's sequence 7 of the Spectator pathway. You can gather the information first, and there's no rush to purchase them. Once I have clues regarding the dark-patterned Black Panther and Spring of the Elves marrow crystals, we can proceed." "Ah, if you are willing to exchange it for gold pounds, you can buy it at any time. Although I'm out of money recently, I can still raise quite a bit if it's urgent." Audrey comforted herself. Alger said in a deep voice, "Potion formula of the Sailor Pathways sequence 6 Wind Blessed. This will be more expensive than the Beyonder ingredients that you want, combined. If you find it, you can think of the additional payment needed to make up for the difference. I can't guarantee that I'll be able to help you gather those ingredients. Even if it's just one of them, you don't need to expend any resources ahead of time. Mr. Hanged Man should have a close relationship with the Church of the Lord of Storms. He should be able to get the Wind-Blessed formula normally, right? Is he trying to hide the fact that he's digesting the Seafarer potion quickly?" Klein was startled. "All right," the world answered in a low voice and then said, "I have another request." The world looked around and said, "I want to get information about all the abject nobles in the Lowen Kingdom, including their current addresses. The more details, the better." He didn't directly mention Baronet Pound since Detective Sherlock Moriarty was currently handling an investigation regarding an underground structure that involved the Pound family. Klein didn't want Justice to figure out the world's identity through this connection. "I can't ignore any details," he emphasized to himself. Audrey stared blankly upon hearing that. She once again examined the member at the end of the long bronze table and probed, "What do you want to do?" The world laughed with a hoarse voice. "That's not something you need to worry about. I'm only searching for some things. I won't do them any harm. I can swear on this point and allow Mr. Fool to bear witness. Mr. World is really good at controlling his body language. Is his sequence the nemesis of a spectator or telepathist? Audrey thoughtfully nodded and said, I know some information about abject aristocrats, but it's not sufficiently detailed, concrete, or comprehensive. I need some time to gather all of it. It'll take 3 or 4 days, is that okay? As a noble, it was compulsory to have some knowledge about people in the same class. Audrey would always hear interesting stories when she attended various balls, banquets, and saloons, but they would all be fragmented and could hardly be considered a comprehensive body of knowledge. After all, she wasn't an expert in this field, and she still needed to fill in the details by flipping through books, asking around, and checking references to not miss any abject nobles. No problem. The world laughed deeply. Then, what payment would you like in return? The things I can pay you with right now are some secret history from the fourth epoch, knowledge of some Beyonder pathways, and a few formulas. But frankly, I don't think that information concerning abject nobles is worth sequence 7 or 8 potions. Hey, if you have any other requests, I can attempt to complete them. It's not of equal value to sequence 8 or 7 potion formulas, which means I'm unable to make a corresponding request for the psychiatrist formula. Audrey began to ponder seriously. During this process, she sneaked a glance at Mr. Fool, hoping for a hint, only to discover that Mr. Fool was shrouded in the grey fog and had no reaction whatsoever. He was like a god staring at the land beneath him. All right, Audrey finally made a decision and smiled. I want to hear about knowledge regarding other Beyonder pathways, but this is on the premise that I'm not aware of them. Dear Mr. Fool, can you be the judge for this? Yes, Klein answered calmly. Then, let's have a private conversation. Audrey looked at the world. At that moment, Klein rapped the table, isolating the son and the hanged man from hearing or seeing the exchange. He deliberately nodded to his smurf, indicating that they could begin their private conversation. The world looked at Miss Justice and spoke with his usual hoarse voice, Do you know anything about the Demonist sect? Audrey recalled the information she paid the hanged man Alger £1,000 for and answered briefly with caution. I know what they believe in and what era they began from, as well as the Beyonder pathways they control and the inclination of their upper echelons. The world laughed hoarsely and said, I understand. You don't know much. The Demonist sect controls the assassin pathway. The sequence 8 is instigator. That's what I know, Audrey said, partially to inform the world, and partially to show her anticipation. The world raised his hand and stroked his chin before saying, Then, do you know the corresponding sequence 7? Audrey shook her head slightly. I'll be very happy to hear it from you. The assassin pathway's sequence 7 is called Witch, the world said simply. Witch? Audrey jumped in fright at this word. She naturally made the corresponding connections in her mind. Then, if a man consumes this potion, how is he supposed to act? Wearing beautiful dresses and putting on exquisite makeup, imitating a lady's every move? She was a little disgusted, yet strangely amused as the thought came to her. No, Miss Justice. When a man consumes this potion, he will no longer be considered a male. He will become a true lady. Klein resisted the urge to chortle as he controlled the world's response. Goddess, the witch potion can change a person's sex? Audrey blurted out. This is really unbelievable. Mr. Fool didn't deny it, which means it's true. This is simply a miracle. This is the mysterious Beyonder world. This is a world filled with all sorts of inexplicable things. This is the world I long for. Why am I feeling a little excited? After calming down a little, Audrey quickly and guiltily glanced at Mr. Fool and made a tiny confession that she had actually chanted the name of the Evernight goddess in front of him. The world said in a low, hoarse voice, Yes, but it can only make men become women. Women will accordingly have their charms enhanced. Whether it's their appearance or skin condition, they will become significantly improved, on the basis of their original looks. This is the reason why the upper echelons of the Demonist sect are all women. Then, what flaws does it have? Audrey suddenly felt her interest was aroused. The world answered in an unhurried manner, the requirement for their acting is to become evil-doers who bring about calamity, disease, and pain. Audrey exhaled slightly and felt a little disappointed. Her mind whirled quickly, and she immediately had a new question. If, and I'm saying if, an animal consumes the witch formula without dying or losing control, would the enhancement of its charms be more suited to human tastes, or focused on charms for its own species? For example, a female cat which makes all male cats become fanatical towards it. The world was momentarily unsure how to respond. After a few seconds, he said, I've never studied such matters. Before Audrey could ask further, he added, the corresponding sequence 6 for the witch pathway is pleasure, or the demoness of pleasure. The requirement for acting is to bring pleasure to both men and women, mainly in that aspect, as well as controlling or influencing them. The demonesses of this sequence are very good at using special spider silk. Audrey gaped her beautiful mouth, then she silently closed it again, deeply regretting her pinings from before. By knowing such information, it will allow you to effectively identify demonesses. Heh heh, are you pleased with this payment? The world asked. Audrey nodded gently and said, it helps me a lot. The deal is completed. I will help you gather information on the abject nobles as soon as possible. Shall I give it to you the next time we meet? The world thought for a moment and asked, can it be faster? Then, I'll offer the information I gathered to Mr. Fool and request that he bestow them to you. Mr. Fool, is that okay? Audrey turned her head and asked. In the thick gray fog, Klein nodded his head in agreement. At the same time, he busily controlled the world to whisper he. He detected the different way she said the word. Noticing the world's astonishment, the corners of Audrey's mouth curled up slightly, her eyes rolling upwards as she intentionally didn't make any explanation. Klein rapped the long bronze table, indicating the end of the private exchange. Then, he once again manipulated the world to say, I have one more problem. This newcomer has indeed accumulated a lot of requests. Audrey looked over, unsurprised. Alger and Derek both indicated they were listening through their body language. The world said hoarsely, I want to know if there are any more high-sequence Beyonders in the Sauron family in Intis. While the world spoke, Klein looked at the sun through the corners of his eye and saw that the youth didn't have any additional reaction. From the looks of it, the City of Silver doesn't have records of the Sauron family. This family most likely made an uprising after the cataclysm. Klein looked around thoughtfully and discovered Justice and the Hanged Man looking at each other, obviously unaware of the answer. The sun was undoubtedly at a loss and silent. Thus, he lightly tapped the table again and said, let me answer this question. What can you pay for it? Before he could finish his sentence, Klein hurriedly controlled the world to say, a formula, a sequence 7 formula. Okay. Deal. Klein created an environment for a private exchange as he silently stared at his Smurf for a few seconds. Audrey and Alger, who were blocked, once again felt how unfathomable Mr. Fool was. They were both curious about the answer, but they also felt that it was of no use to them. It wasn't worth it to spend a sequence 7 potion formula in exchange for that. After the private exchange, Klein deliberately made the world bow and say in a hoarse voice, Honorable Mr. Fool, thank you for your answer, it was very helpful to me. This is an equivalent exchange, there's no need to thank me. Klein endured the goosebumps that suddenly surfaced on his skin as he answered indifferently. The open communication that followed lasted less than 10 minutes. Then, he announced the end of tarot gathering before severing the connections with the Crimson Stars. After the figures of Justice, the Hanged Man, and the sun dissipated into streams of light, Klein looked at the world and chuckled. With a Smurf, a lot of things are really much more convenient. Unfortunately, the all-black eye cannot be used outside the gray fog. What a pity. As he thought that, he controlled the world to stand up and bow, then he let it melt into the majestic palace. As he had to divert some of his attention in order to control his Smurf, Klein had expended a great deal of his spirituality. He didn't continue staying in that space, and after retrieving the all-black eye and placing it behind the bronze table, he immediately returned to the real world. At that moment, there was a rare case of backland sunshine, seen in autumn or winter, behind the tightly shut curtains. Klein didn't have the time to take in this view. He slept for half an hour to recover some of his energy. After waking up, due to having gained Miss Justice's promise and the fact that it wasn't urgent, he had no plans on searching for information at the library, and instead, decided to head to one of the many cemetery sites on the outskirts of Backland before nightfall. Klein was going to test the influence of Azek's copper whistle to understand its scope and limitations. Of course, the experiment would only be carried out after dark. The reason why he was heading out now was that it would be very strange and very eye-catching to hire a carriage to visit a cemetery in the evening. When the steam metro arrived at the southern bank of the Tussock River, Klein rented a carriage and headed to the Aston Cemetery on the outskirts of the South Borough, which was managed by the Church of the God of Steam and Machinery. Under the darkness of dusk, the trees around the cemetery seemed to bare their fangs and brandish their claws, blocking out the light like monsters lurking in the darkness. After the carriage driver took the 4 soldi Klein paid, he looked at the cemetery and muttered, "Do you need me to wait here for you?" "No, there's no need. I'm here to visit a friend." Klein came up with an excuse, and he immediately noticed the change in the driver's face. This is a cemetery, to visit a friend with the sky already dark. The driver could hear his own heart thumping. Klein jolted to his senses, smiled, and added, "He's the tombkeeper here." The carriage driver was immediately relieved, but he didn't dare stay. He quickly drove the horses and left. Klein circled the graveyard until the night truly set in. After dark, the smoke and dust emissions decreased by a lot. In addition to the biting cold wind, the fog in the air thinned a lot. Although few stars could be seen, the crimson moon made a furtive appearance, covering the ground with a veil-like glow. Klein tapped his chest 4 times clockwise, drawing out the crimson moon. Then, he put on his gloves, pushed himself over the iron fence, and entered the cemetery. He looked around with a high degree of caution, randomly found a secluded corner, took out Azek's copper whistle, and held it in his hand. Not far in front of him was a tombstone. The photograph on it was dirty, and the epitaph appeared extremely blurry in the moonlight. Klein carefully read it for a few seconds before figuring out what they were. "Friend, if you are passing by, help me up. Thanks. A very humorous gentleman. I choose you." Klein stopped, leaned back against the trees that sheltered the grave from the sun and rain, and waited patiently in the cold, chilly night. He threw Azek's copper whistle up before catching it firmly, repeating it several times to pass the time until 20 minutes later. No signs of the dead coming back to life. Klein clicked his pocket watch shut, surveyed his surroundings, and confirmed the results. "I'll come back here in 2 days to see if there are any additional changes. If there are none, it means that Mr. Azek's copper whistle won't be able to affect corpses that have been laid to rest through a priest's ritual." Klein silently muttered to himself, and he put the ancient and exquisite copper whistle back into his pocket. There were 3 kinds of burials in the Loan Kingdom. The first type had coffins and corpses, suitable for the middle and upper classes living in abundance. The second type was the ones without corpses, so a cremation was held. The remaining ashes were placed in urns. This was the choice of the lower middle class and technical workers who could pay for the cremation but found coffins to be too wasteful. But there were also times when religious and governmental factors had an impact, such as the believers of the eternal blazing sun. The majority of them underwent cremation, and the poor people only needed to pay a small fee for the cremation due to the help they received from the government. The third only belonged to the poor. They couldn't afford coffins, and they didn't wish for cremation, so they just wrapped the corpses up and buried them. But Klein had already determined from the tombstones and tombs that the target of his experiment was the kind which involved a coffin and a corpse. If Azek's copper whistle really can cause the dead to rise, even if the target had rotted into a pile of bones, there shouldn't be a complete lack of reaction. Even if the lid of the coffin cannot be opened, it should have at least created a dull thud. As he walked towards the fence, Klein suddenly thought of a non-rigorous part of the experiment. "Yes, I need to categorize them. The corpses here have been buried for quite a while. I should find a target that was recently buried. Only by doing so will I be able to arrive at the most accurate conclusion." After that, Klein basically played a game of cat and mouse with the cemetery guardians before finding a grave that had completed a burial ceremony during the day. This time, he waited for half an hour, but he still didn't find anything abnormal. "Phew, I can basically determine that Mr. Azek's copper whistle can't affect a corpse that has undergone a ritual that puts the soul to rest. That's quite weak. No, that's not right. This copper whistle isn't meant to cause the dead to come alive. It's used to summon messengers, so affecting a corpse is a negative effect." Klein tightened his double-breasted coat and walked toward the iron fence. He planned on heading home to have a change of clothes before trying out his second experiment. The target of the second experiment group were the recently deceased corpses that haven't been laid to rest via ritual. Such targets often existed in a hospital's morgue. Climbing over the fence, Klein made his way back to the South Burrow on foot in the dreary, dark night. The surroundings were deathly still and quiet. Only the evergreen, dust-covered trees lightly swayed. It reminded him of the night he had been resurrected from the dead. Back then, he too had to walk from the cemetery to the city. Sigh. Klein sighed and suddenly began to run, as if trying to get rid of the melancholy that filled him. More than half an hour later, he rented a carriage in South Burrow and headed for the nearest steam metro station. There was still about an hour before the metro stopped running, and this could save him quite a bit of money. In the wee hours of the morning, Klein changed into a grayish-blue worker's uniform and wore a cap as he made his way to St. Eston's Hospital in the Backland Bridge area. This was a charity hospital belonging to the Church of the God of Steam and Machinery. Many of the poor died here due to illness, and since there was nowhere for them to place their bodies, they had to be kept in the hospital morgue. There, the corpses awaited cremation from the government or be donated to the medical schools. This phenomenon was very common in summer, but there weren't many in the autumn or winter after it cooled down. However, in an era without air conditioning or equipment to keep the temperature cool, the hospital's morgue couldn't keep the corpses for too long. Donated bodies would be quickly embalmed and bodies to be buried the next day would be cleaned up. Of course, these were the rules enforced in summer. In autumn and winter, the rules were relatively relaxed. Therefore, there were still many corpses left overnight in the morgue during this period. The morgue at St. Estan was underground. It was relatively cool, even during the summer, and was biting cold during autumn and winter. Based on what he had learned as a nighthawk, Klein relied on a clown's agility and balance to sneak into the basement while avoiding the doctors and nurses that were on duty. Before he even got close to the morgue, he felt a chill down his spine. After quickly moving past the janitor's room, Klein took out a piece of wire and lightly unlocked the door to the morgue. This was one of the methods of infiltration and tracking. He slowly and silently pushed open the door to the morgue with his black-gloved right hand. At the same time, he cloaked Azek's copper whistle in his spirituality to determine if such a method could eliminate the negative effects. The temperature in the morgue seemed to be lower than the corridor. Most of the corpses were bagged up and placed in different iron cabinets. Only a few were placed on the long table in the central open space, as if they were awaiting examination. As a Sequence 8 clown, Klein was no longer afraid of such scenes. He just instinctively felt uncomfortable. Carefully, he closed the door and walked around the long tables. After about 10 minutes, Klein let out a breath of cold air and confirmed that none of the corpses had come to life. It's about time. He took out his gold pocket watch and opened it. When he was ready, Klein withdrew his spirituality and stopped enveloping Azek's copper whistle. He wasn't sure if it was a psychological effect, but he had a baffling feeling that the surroundings had become even more silent. As a seer, he fully believed in his instincts. He stopped pacing back and forth and retreated towards the door. Time ticked by, and Klein determined that it took about 2 minutes. At that moment, a corpse on a long table suddenly sat up. Bang! 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 The surrounding iron cabinets emitted a series of banging noises, as though all hell was about to break loose. Bang! 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 Upon hearing such a commotion and seeing the corpses sit up, Klein suddenly said in a low voice, "Crimson." Immediately following that, he injected his spirituality into a requiem charm and threw it out. Icy blue flames burned quietly, and serene and gentle blackness spread out. The corpses lay down once again, and the banging sounds coming from the cabinets came to an abrupt halt. Klein, who had experienced a similar situation, didn't relax and used another requiem charm. As there were many corpses around him, he used a third charm to be safe, using up everything that he had. Not bad. Indeed, it only affects corpses that haven't been put to rest via ritual. This includes corpses that haven't been dead for too long and zombies. Using my spirituality to shield the whistle can prevent such effects. Klein thought with a smile. Seeing that none of the corpses were making any abnormal reactions, he prepared to open the door and leave. At that moment, he suddenly heard footsteps coming from the outside and saw a faint light seeping in. The elderly janitor had been attracted by the banging sound in the morgue. He was approaching with a lantern in hand. Klein looked around. Placing his hand on the door, he nimbly jumped up, stopping at the spot between the door and the ceiling. His fingers dug into the bumps and cracks as he maintained perfect balance. Creak! The elderly janitor opened the door with his key and entered the morgue. He took a few steps forward, held up his lantern, and examined the iron cabinets and long tables, as well as the corpses. Behind him, Klein nimbly jumped down and landed silently. Seizing the opportunity, Klein quickly escaped from the morgue. He used the janitor's room to hide for a few seconds before carefully returning to the upper floor. After the elderly janitor surveyed the surroundings and didn't find anything out of the ordinary, he mumbled a sentence, in fear of the corpses, and quickly left. He locked the door and didn't stay any longer. Returning to the guardroom, he wrapped a thin blanket around himself and took several minutes to calm his racing heart before mumbling to himself in a low voice, "Those old guys always tell me about the weird things that happen in the morgue, hoping to scare me. Those weird sounds just now should count as well. It doesn't matter. Those corpses didn't come back to life either. Pooey, there are no such things as zombies and wraiths." At the same time, Klein was walking comfortably along the quiet, dark streets, happy to be free of a latent threat. He looked at the elegant gas lamps that lined the sides of the street and looked forward to the future Beyonder gatherings. As long as he obtained a weapon with a special effect, he would be able to obtain one of the main ingredients of a magician. Although I don't have much money right now, I still have a lot of assets that I can use to exchange. For example, the Telepathus potion formula, or the formulas for Bard and Light Suppliant. Furthermore, my clown potion is digesting at a faster rate than I expected due to series of events and my discovery of the essence needed for acting. It's close to being completely digested. Along the streets of Backland at night, Klein left his mind wandering. On the outskirts of Empress Borough, in a wide, empty horse track, Audrey Hall deliberately led a chestnut mare to a corner and pretended to discuss something with Viscount Glaint. She was wearing white pants and knee-high black boots, adorned with a simple blouse and a black jacket that reached her waist. In addition, she donned a helmet of the same color. She looked especially valiant and beautiful, and Susie, her golden retriever, was obediently sitting by her feet. What seemed like a tiny leather satchel hung from her back. Disguised as Viscount Glaint's servant, Zio glanced enviously at Audrey's long, straight legs, and unconsciously tiptoed. Just horse riding is so blasé. Only when it is combined with hunting does it become imbued with life. Of course, I mean the equestrian skills for men. No matter what a beautiful lady does, it would still be a sight to behold. Glaint sized up Audrey and said half-jokingly. Audrey replied with a slight smile, the next hunt is still months away. Every year, from June to the New Year, the aristocrats of the Lowen Kingdom would come to Backland to attend various banquets, dances, and salons, as per tradition. This was a very important event for them, and many things would be decided within a few months. After the New Year, the nobles would return to their fiefdom, their castles, country estates, and large plantations, and spend their leisure time there. In such times, the most popular sport was hunting. The nobles would invite guests of similar status to enjoy the pleasure of horse riding and chasing prey. As long as their financial situation allowed it, they weren't stingy with buying hounds. The most famous of the hounds was the foxhound. I already miss that life. Backland is a place where people feel constrained, and its air is indescribably terrible. Of course, I still enjoy its extravagance. Viscount Glaint wore his gloves and stepped back to make it easier for Audrey to talk to Zio and Furs. Honorable Miss Audrey, why have you called us here this time? Zio initiated the question as she retracted her gaze. Audrey took a large portion of most of her recent income. She was honest and generous, a rarely encountered good employer. I seem to smell the ink of money again. Hopefully, the mission wouldn't be too difficult. Miss Audrey is perfect in every way, except for one thing. Every mission is unexpected and very dangerous. Zio thought, feeling both anticipation and apprehension. She couldn't help but glance sideways at Furs. She noticed that her companion, disguised as a maid, was looking right at her. The expressions reflected in their eyes looked very similar. Audrey held her gloves, smiled reservedly and elegantly before saying, "It's a simple request this time." As she spoke, she motioned with her eyes for Zio and Furs to open the leather satchel on Susie. Zio, who had always been known for her proactiveness, immediately took 2 steps forward and bent down to reach out with her hand. During this short period of time, she had originally wanted to pat Susie's head to show that she meant no harm. But just as she extended her right palm, Susie had already turned her head, turning her body half around, placing the small leather satchel in front of her. I'm usually popular with animals. For example, mosquitoes. Zio kept her expression unchanged as she unzipped the satchel and took out a stack of papers from Susie's leather pouch. She stood up and took a look at the stack of papers. She saw that it depicted a young man with ordinary looks, but his neatly combed hair, round glasses, and mocking brown eyes all looked very familiar to her. I must have seen him somewhere. Zio looked down and saw the corresponding description. Formerly used name, Lenivis, wanted swindler. I know where I've seen him before. Zio was suddenly enlightened and almost made an inelegant gesture of slapping her forehead. Before she met Audrey, one of the main sources of her income was flipping through newspapers, researching wanted posters, and using her connections in many gangs in East Borough to seek out criminals who were worth fat bounties. I had thought of finding this Lenivis, who has a bounty of £100. Besides, he swept away more than £10,000 in cash. However, I've recently been too busy with Miss Audrey's requests and had forgotten about this matter. Zio and Furs looked at each other and then asked frankly, how much is this request worth? How much is the request worth? Audrey was startled for a moment. She had completely forgotten the matter of payment, as from her point of view, it was a test from Mr. Fool. When were examinees ever given money? £100? Audrey deliberated and gave a number. Deal. Zio and Furs answered in unison. If we can catch him, not only would we receive £100 from Miss Audrey, but we can also obtain an equal amount from the bounty. What a great mission. Zio asked casually, her eyes shining. Why are you looking for this swindler? Did he swindle you of your money? I don't even know who he is. It's really a simple request. £100 was enough to complete the deal. There's no need to tell Mr. Fool about this. It's only £100. Audrey, with a polite smile, ignored Zio's question and instead mentioned, I received word that he's in Backland. Ah yes, there are a dozen or so portraits here, different portraits. I took into account that Lenevis must have disguised himself, so I'm giving you pictures of him without glasses, with a beard, with a change of hairstyle. Pictures based on conjectures. I'm also very good at drawing and painting. Audrey tilted her chin. Zio immediately forgot her previous question and said in pleasant surprise, this is really good news. She felt as though she could already see the bounty of £200 beckoning at her. The mysterious person she had met at Mr. A's gathering had yet to establish contact with her. Therefore, all she could do was continue with her business of earning money. Audrey nodded indiscernibly. She muttered, do you have any leads on the matter regarding the psychology alchemists? Furs adjusted her long curly hair, looked at Viscount Glaint who was listening to the side, and said, I recently joined a new Beyonder gathering. Rumor has it that the Spectator and Telepathus potion formulas have previously appeared there. I'm suspecting that one of the members from the gathering is from the psychology alchemists. I'll apply to bring you with me the next gathering. All right. Audrey deliberately didn't hide her joy. She had read their true state of mind from the colors, body language, and the subtle expressions of Zio and Furs, to judge their enthusiasm for the mission. They didn't lie regarding the psychology alchemists either. Viscount Glaint mumbled, Audrey's matters seems to be on the brink of success. Where's my formula, Audrey? There are really no clues as of yet. The apothecary pathway is mostly in the south, where the Phaenopotter kingdom is. Furs gestured with deep regret. All right, I'm still young. I'm only in my early 20s. I still have time to wait, Glaint replied in a humorous tone. All right, thank you for your help. See you again next time. Audrey bowed gracefully, wore her gloves, and mounted her horse as she rode down the track. Susie happily followed, as if she had found new entertainment. As he spent the night, experimenting, it was already 9:34 of a Tuesday morning by the time Klein woke up. Biting into a piece of bread slathered with butter, he wore his coat and hat, hurried out the door, and wrote on the message book hanging by the doorbell's pull rope. Owner is out and will be back after 5 in the afternoon. Actually, he didn't have much to do. It was purely to guard against a sudden visit from Millet Carter. If the other party found out that the detective he hired for a full £50 wasn't out and about, searching for information or organizing people to confirm the layout of the structure, and was instead at home leisurely drinking tea and reading novels, he would surely revoke the commission and not pay the last £40. I really have nothing to do but wait for Miss Justice's information. Klein stood at the end of the street and looked at the haze in the sky, while helplessly muttering to himself. He had already decided last night where he would spend the day. In the morning, I'll practice shooting at the Quelaag Club, read the newspapers, enjoy a free lunch, take a nap in the afternoon, exercise through playing sports like squash. Once the Bravehearts bar opens, I'll take a carriage there and see if I can learn about more Beyonder gatherings from Caspars. Klein had no intention of looking for Marich. Although he was certain that he had more than one circle of Beyonders, he was afraid that Miss Bodyguard would also belong to those circles. It wouldn't be convenient for him to sell potion formulas, as it would arouse a high degree of suspicion. Since the true creator has given you the ability to divine and a strong body, would he still grant you potion formulas that you do not need? It's impossible just thinking about it. Klein filled in the details with his imagination as he boarded the public carriage that headed for Hillston Borough. Half an hour later, he entered the Quelaag Club and saw an acquaintance. It was Talum Dumont, the equestrian teacher who had recommended him to the club. He was Mary Gale's friend. Dressed in a black tweed overcoat, the brown-haired Talum walked over. He sized up Klein and said with an odd smile, "Good morning. Mary and Dorrigu are getting a divorce. Are you suspecting the reason why I joined the club?" Relying on the clown's ability, Klein easily made a surprised expression. "Really? That is really surprising." Talum gave him a deeply suspicious look and suddenly laughed. I have a friend who's been troubled about something recently. I want to know how good your marksmanship and fighting skills are. A commission? He only asked about my marksmanship and fighting skills, not reasoning. This is a request involving violence. Klein smiled and said, I was planning on heading to the shooting range. You can take a look, but fighting requires an opponent to be able to see my standard. I've learned how to fight before, Talim eagerly replied. Bang, bang, bang. Holding onto a revolver that he rented from the Quelaag Club with one hand, Klein pulled the trigger repeatedly, hitting the bullseye accurately, with the worst shot hitting the 8 ring. By feeding his practice with live bullets, along with the superhuman control that he had after becoming a clown, his marksmanship was considered rather excellent. If I continue practicing for a few months, I could even be considered a sharpshooter. Klein unloaded the revolver in satisfaction and cleared the empty shells. They fell to the ground noisily as he looked at Talim Dumont with a smile. Are you satisfied? Very good. The equestrian teacher, Talim, had already taken off his black tweed overcoat and light gray sweater and adopted a boxing stance. Come on, let me see the standard of your fighting skills. I can tell you frankly that I've received training as a trainee knight since I was young, and I've never let it go to waste. As a Beyander, if I can't even beat an ordinary man who has only received training, then I might as well die. Klein cursed silently. Without taking off his double-breasted coat, he set down his revolver. Klein took 2 side steps and gestured to Talim that he could begin. He originally wanted to wriggle his finger to add to the atmosphere, but when he thought of the other party's strength, he couldn't be bothered to waste his time. Talim appeared to be a little excited as he began bounce-stepping a little. He suddenly pressed forward and threw out a punch to the right. Klein blocked and grabbed with his left hand, bent low and twisted his waist before reaching out his right palm, and did a smooth backflip. Thud. Talim flew out, landing on his back. Klein didn't exert any strength towards the end, only throwing him off his feet through the use of inertia. Impressive. Talim quickly stood up and gave a thumbs up. As expected of a famous detective. Your marksmanship and fighting skills are excellent. I only beat a weak chicken like you, so how can you tell that my fighting skills are very high? Klein secretly lampooned and asked with a smile, now that you have a better picture, can you tell me what kind of request your friend has? Heh, he will come to the club later. You can talk amongst yourselves. Talim massaged his back as he said, as for what the request exactly entails, I'm not sure either. Oh right, he's a reporter at the Daily Observer, Mike Joseph. He's probably hoping for some short-term protection. Alright, Klein didn't ask any more questions. He continued practicing his shooting, but he didn't limit himself to a revolver. He also practiced with a hunting rifle, a single-shot rifle, and a repeating rifle. He hoped that if he encountered any problems in the future, he would be able to use any of the firearms around him. Shortly before 12 noon, he returned to the first floor, went into the buffet cafeteria, and got a serving of roast chicken and a piece of pan-fried steak, as well as the club's limited supply of cream cheese lobster. After placing his meal down, Klein got some Fanapotter seafood rice, fruit salad, oyster broth, and marquee black tea. Facing this sumptuous lunch, he couldn't help but swallow a mouthful of saliva as he praised the goddess in his heart. If this was eaten outside, it would probably cost 3 soldi. Klein switched between using silver knives, forks, and spoons as he ate in contentment. When he was almost done with the food on the table, Talim Dumont led a man, in a heavy overcoat and a half-top hat, over. Detective Moriarty, this is the friend I was talking about, Mike Joseph. Mike, this is the famous detective, Mr. Sherlock Moriarty. Talim smiled and introduced them. Nice to meet you. Mike took off his hat and bowed. He looked to be in his late 20s, with rather sparse eyebrows and rough skin. His pores were unusually prominent. However, his facial features weren't bad. His blue eyes were especially charming. The 2 thin lines from the meager mustache gave him a somewhat mature charm. Klein couldn't help but stroke the stubble that had become thicker around his lips. He got up and invited the other party to sit down, then he smiled and said, today's cream cheese lobster is pretty good. You can give it a try. Alright, Mike Joseph didn't refuse. He took a plate, made a circle, and picked up a lot of food. He came in a hurry, so he hasn't had lunch yet. Talim smiled as he explained for his friend and placed a stack of newspapers on the table. I can tell. Klein set down his knife and fork, wiped his mouth with a napkin, and sipped his black tea leisurely. He was very satisfied with the meal. At that moment, Mike Joseph came back with 2 plates of food. He took a few quick bites to fill his stomach before looking up at Klein. Detective Moriarty, have you heard about the recent serial murders? The ones which had organs removed? Klein's heart skipped a beat as he asked. Talam nodded and said wistfully, as expected, every detective is paying attention to this serial killer. Mike pulled out one of the papers and pushed it to Klein. This is the latest story. Klein took it and discovered that it was the Daily Observer where Mike worked at. On the front page were the words, 11. Another lady killed. Civilas Yard is helpless. The headquarters of the Backland Police Department was located at Civilas Street at the edge of Empress Borough, so they were also known as Civilas Yard. 11? It's already the 11th case? Klein resisted the urge to frown and continued reading. He found that it was indeed the same as the case he had previously encountered. The victim was a woman dressed in a gorgeous long skirt and had her intestines removed from her stomach. This is clearly a case with signs of devil worship all over it. The Civilas Yard must have handed the case to the Nighthawks, mandated punishers, or the machinery hivemind squads. They have people capable of divination, mediumship, and all sorts of magical and effective Beyonder methods. How is it that the case hasn't been cracked? Why isn't the criminal arrested yet? Does the criminal have rich, anti-investigation powers and is able to destroy the souls of the deceased? Or could it be that the deceased's soul, along with her innards, were extracted to fulfill the requirements of the devil worship ritual? Yes, he's definitely capable of interfering with divination. Indeed, if the devil pathway Beyonders lack such powers, how could they dare commit serial murders? Klein thought as he said to Mike Joseph, "Do you want to do a private investigation?" "I'm sorry, I can't take this case. Without the invitation of the police, I cannot take it. I have to maintain a good relationship with them. The so-called good relationship is the kind where they invite me to the police station for coffee." Klein did some self-critical lampooning. The real reason for his refusal was that it was easy to run into official Beyonders involved in the investigation of the serial killings, perhaps including the Backland Diocese's Nighthawks. No, not an investigation. No, the precise description is that it's not an investigation to seek the murderer. "I just want to finish my report." Mike Joseph swallowed some shrimp and explained. "Report?" Klein put down his white enamel cup, crossed his hands, and leisurely asked Mike Joseph. Mike Joseph said, "If you buy the Daily Observer tomorrow or the day after, you'll see my in-depth coverage on the serial killings. The most important part is my reveal of what the victims have in common so as to alert people who fall into this group." "Oh, what do they have in common?" Klein asked curiously. Mike took a sip of his coffee and said, "Besides being a woman and wearing a colorful dress, there's one other important thing they have in common. I did a thorough investigation of the victim's career and found an interesting tidbit. Some of them are maids, others textile workers, tailors, and even teachers. On the surface, there doesn't seem to be any overlap, but in reality, they've all been street girls." "Street girl? A teacher?" Klein asked in surprise. In the Lowen Kingdom, teachers were part of the middle class and received at least £2 a week. That was enough to make a woman lead quite a good life, so there was no need for her to be a street girl. The corner of Mike's mouth twitched as he sighed and said, "Yes, in the past. They may have had very difficult times before they found a job that could support them. I've done a survey before. In Backland, 1 in 6 women less than sup greater than 1 less than sup greater than aged 15 to 55 as or has been a street girl. Hey, this is our country. Foreigners who come here are surprised that a very conservative country, a bustling metropolis, would actually be filled with street girls. This number is a little exaggerated. If it were true, it could only be said that reality can be more exaggerated than fiction. This damned world." Klein was speechless. After some thought, he said deliberately, "One question, how does the murderer know that the victim had been a street girl? They don't have labels on them, and even you needed a thorough investigation to discover this." As expected of a great detective, this might be the clue, Mike Joseph answered without feeling surprised. "No, if it was a Beyonder from the devil path, then the standard he would choose from would be someone who appears to have sunken low but didn't actually degenerate completely. Furthermore, they should have a keen intuition towards degeneration, and they might be able to see the corresponding color that runs deep. With the colorful dress as a trigger, the target will basically be locked onto." Klein answered himself and asked, "So, what else do you wish to investigate?" Mike nodded and said, "From these 11 cases, 10 of the ladies were once street girls, except one. She's still a prostitute at present. Yes, she's the youngest, 16-year-old cyber. This makes it very, very odd. I wish to visit Golden Rose, which is the place where she works for further investigation." I want to see if I can discover anything. I'm worried that my questions will anger the people there, so I plan to ask you to protect me temporarily. You don't need to teach them a lesson, and you just need to protect me at the most critical juncture and allow my escape. If nothing happens, I'll pay you £1, and if there's a fight, it'll be raised to £5. What do you think? Klein laughed and replied, let me wash my hands before replying you. He bowed politely and sauntered over to the bathroom where he tossed a coin and obtained a positive answer. 19 Hope Street, Sherwood Borough. This area was located close to the Tussock River which went through Backland. Pedestrians could see the turbid but unusually wide water surface through the cracks and crevices in their houses. The Daily Observer reporter, Mike Joseph, alighted the carriage and pointed at a 3-story, grayish-blue building ahead of them. He said to Klein, who was standing next to him and wearing a black double-breasted suit and a half-top hat and gold-rimmed glasses, that's the Golden Rose, the best legal brothel in the area of the Backland Bridge, as well as Sherwood Borough. It opens at 3 in the afternoon and stays open until 2 in the morning. The best legal brothels in the Sherwood and Backland Bridge regions? In other words, there are better ones in these two regions but they're illegal? Klein silently mused and shot a glance at the entrance which had an inlaid golden rose. It didn't hang any signboards. This doesn't count as a street girl, right? He answered without thinking. Of course, it's of a higher grade. Mike personally led Klein to the front of the building and pushed the door open. As soon as he entered, Klein caught a whiff of a mixed fragrance that was slightly pungent and heard a soothing yet suggestive melody. Instinctively, he looked around and saw bouncers, in black coats and half-top hats, standing on either side of the entrance and in every corner of the hall. As a legitimate business, they were obviously meant to deal with drunkards and boors. The Golden Hall was surrounded by all sorts of sofas, chairs, and even a piano. In the center, there was a dancing area. At that moment, there were many ladies sitting in different areas with their hair colored in gold, brown, pale yellow, or black. Some of them looked mature, some shy and young, some young and attractive, and others who were rather beautiful. These ladies were either enjoying the melody, giggling whilst in conversations with each other, quietly reading newspapers and magazines, or dancing with the men. It was only 3:30 in the afternoon, so there weren't many customers. At a glance, this place looked more like a proper ball than a brothel. If you come after 8 in the evening, you'll see some interesting performances. If any of the ladies catch your eye, go over and invite them to dance and then ask them for their prices amidst the beautiful melody. If both sides can come to an agreement, you can head to the 2nd or 3rd floor and have a wonderful time in some room. As long as you're willing to spend money, you can sleep here the entire night. Mike turned his head from left to right, suddenly losing his previous calm and gentlemanliness, appearing a little more frivolous. He walked into the hall with a smile, and he approached a young girl who was at most 15 or 16 years old. Is he showing his true nature, or is this in conduct of a professional? Klein watched, a little flabbergasted as he subconsciously followed behind Mike Joseph. The victim, Cyber, was only 16 years old. In theory, a girl of similar age is more likely to be a friend and would know more. At that moment, Mike lowered his voice and explained. He then raised his thin eyebrows and asked in a normal voice, "Which lady caught your fancy?" "I'm just your bodyguard," Klein responded with very normal logic. Mike slightly nodded and suddenly laughed. "I'm not used to being watched when I do that sort of thing. I'll be standing watch outside." Klein understood what Mike meant, and took a serious, professional stance. Without another word, Mike walked up to the young girl, bent down, and extended his hand, inviting her to dance. Being a prostitute at this age, Backland sure is so bedazzling and dirty. Hey, to think that there would be a middle-aged gentleman of seemingly good bearing patronizing this place. Even the sides of his hair are white. Klein lowered his hands and stood very straight, watching Mike and the young girl engage in a slow dance. After a few minutes, Mike walked back and said to Klein with slight annoyance, "It's too expensive." As the two approached each other, he added in a low voice, "The girl knew Cyber, but the owner, ma'am, Lopez, forbids them from speaking with anyone else on this matter. Otherwise, they would be severely punished." God, when the punishment was mentioned, the poor girl even shuddered instinctively. I can imagine how horrible it must be. Helpless, Klein sighed in sympathy, and asked in a suppressed voice, "So, what are you planning to do?" "I don't want to cause trouble for those girls again. I plan on going straight to Ma'am Lopez." Mike patted Klein on the shoulder and said, "Protect me." Klein turned his body to the side and warned in a serious tone, "If we encounter a dangerous situation, you must listen to me. Do you understand? Listen to me. Okay, okay. Mike raised his hands to his shoulders and nodded. As he spoke, he walked towards a single sofa in the corner. There was a charming lady, with thick makeup, in a gorgeous dress seated there. If you don't want to give up after a dance and embarrass yourself in front of those girls, I suggest you talk to Ma'am Lopez first and find out the prices of the different girls. Mike raised his voice. The lady heard their conversation and looked over. She slowly got up and smiled. Good afternoon, gentlemen. I'm Lopez. Did any girl catch your fancy? Yes. Mike suddenly sized her up and said with a chuckle, I really admire you. I admire you too. You're acting like this as your home. Klein's mouth twitched. Lopez's expression froze for a second, then she gave a fake laugh and said, Sorry, I'm not feeling well today. You should know that there are times every month where women feel quite under the weather. Seeing that there was no way to get Lopez into a room for a conversation, Mike fell silent for a few seconds before suddenly turning serious. Ma'am Lopez, I'm a reporter. I wish to understand more about Cyber's matter. Here's my documentary proof. Lopez's face darkened and she replied impatiently, I've already told everything I know to the police. You should ask them. Cyber was a vagrant orphan who was adopted by me. That night, she accepted an invitation from a guest to spend the night at his house, and she died on her way back in the morning. All right, please leave, or invite a lady to dance. As she spoke, Lopez waved over two of her bouncers. Klein stepped in to shield off Mike Joseph and escorted him back to the hall. Upon seeing this, the two bouncers didn't rashly chase him away. After a few steps, Klein said in a low voice, She's lying. Oh? Mike turned his head in surprise. When she spoke, her eyes darted around. She didn't dare to look at you directly, but she was also secretly sizing you up, which means she was lying and watching your reaction. In addition, her stance was highly defensive, and she appeared very agitated. Klein gave his analysis. Mike opened his mouth and exclaimed after a few seconds, You really are a great detective. Only with your keen observation and outstanding deduction skills were you able to discover such useful details. That's only because I had my spirit vision on and could see that Lopez's emotional colors weren't right. I came up with the reasons after. Klein smiled and said, Thank you, it's time for us to go. Mike Joseph looked back at Lopez and saw that she was walking towards the side door of the hall, as though she was going to her own lounge, and that the side door was in a corner of the room. It was very quiet around there, and there were many areas in the hall that couldn't see what was going on inside. There were also two bouncers standing guard outside. Perhaps we should follow Ma'am Lopez and observe her reaction. Maybe the anxiety from just now will make her do something. Mike suddenly turned his head to look at Klein. Can you take care of those two bouncers quickly? Sir, I'm only responsible for your protection, and that's against the law. Klein smiled in response. I'll pay you more, a total of £5 based on the combat price from before. If there's another fight when we run, it would be £10. Mike Joseph gritted his teeth. Deal. Klein reached out and shook his hand. Afterward, the two of them circled around to avoid the two bouncers from before and quietly approached the side door. Guests, please stop. Please leave this area. One of the bouncers stepped forward and stopped Klein and Mike Joseph. Sorry, we'll immediately. Klein bowed politely and apologized. At that moment, his right fist suddenly punched out, heavily striking at the bouncer's abdomen in front of him. The bouncer instinctively clutched his stomach, his body bent over. As for Klein, who had now stood up, he raised his left hand and chopped the bouncer at the back of the head. Pow! The bouncer fell to the ground and fainted. His companion was clearly caught by surprise at this turn of events. He just stared blankly and failed to react in time. Klein immediately slid over and covered the bouncer's mouth with his right hand and punched his abdomen with his left fist. Bang! The bouncer suddenly bent down and spat out his undigested food, and Klein promptly withdrew his right hand and chopped downward with his palm. At the same time, his left hand supported his opponent, allowing the bouncer to slowly fall onto the ground without making a sound. After exchanging looks, Klein turned the knob, pushed open the side door, and stepped inside. Mike Joseph lowered his body and quickly followed. Why are you so skilled? You're just a reporter. Klein lampooned under his breath, walking briskly but at a rapid pace along the paved corridor. Suddenly, they heard Lopez's voice. Tell Capum not to send anyone over in the next few days. Capum? Send anyone? Klein looked at Mike and found him looking equally puzzled. At that moment, they heard Lopez's footsteps that were headed towards the corridor. Let's go. Klein tugged Mike and ran for the exit without turning back. During this process, he closed the side door and broke the lock in passing. It could prevent the people inside from coming out for a while. Then, as if nothing had happened, they hurriedly walked through the hall and approached the exit while hearing faint, angry voices. After reaching the streets, Mike heaved a sigh of relief and said in amazement and sincerity, "I've experienced many similar scenarios, but not once was it as simple and relaxed as it was today. Thank you. I need to return to find out who Capum is." As he spoke, he took out his wallet, fished out a £5 note, and muttered, "But frankly, your price is really expensive. It's worth more than half a week's salary. But you can claim for reimbursement, right?" Klein answered with a grin. Following that, he asked in concern, "Aren't you afraid that Lopez will find your newspaper firm and get the police to arrest you?" "That's a fake ID card." Mike Joseph shrugged with a gesture of familiarity. Klein could only admire him. After watching Mike board a carriage and leave, he walked diagonally across the street, waited for a public carriage and kept an eye out for anyone chasing after him. At that moment, a rental carriage slowly approached and stopped in front of him. A middle-aged man in a black coat stepped out the carriage and nodded at Klein. He had blue eyes, a thin face, and gray temples. It was the same old gentleman that Klein had seen in the Golden Rose. "He's not a customer of the Golden Rose. He's just like us." Klein suddenly came to this realization. "Hello, I'm Detective Isengard Stanton. I'm assisting the police in this case. Can we have a chat?" The middle-aged man pointed at the carriage tracks. "Detective? A colleague." However, the fact that he's able to assist the police in dealing with such a serious case shows that he truly is a well-known detective, at least within Civilas Yard. Isn't the serial killer involved in devil worship supposed to be handed over to the Nighthawks, mandated punishers, or the machinery hivemind? All the police department needs to do is send a few assistants, so why would they need to seek the help of a private detective? Yes, the 11 serial murders must have caused a sensation. Civilas Yard is under a lot of pressure, and they aren't willing to just wait in misery? Many thoughts flashed through Klein's mind, but on the surface, he revealed a smile. All right. He boarded Isengard Stanton's rented carriage and saw a young man with brown hair inside. "This is my assistant, Isengard, who had a thin and angular face," introduced. "Please, have a seat." He didn't close the carriage's door, nor did he let the carriage driver drive the horse forward to show that he meant no harm. Klein deliberately sat down uneasily and asked worriedly, "What would you like to talk about, Mr. Stanton?" Isengard took out a dark pipe and said, "I want to know what you've learned from following Ma'am Lopez. Did you hear or discover anything? I'm also a detective, and you should know that we have confidentiality agreements in this business," Klein deliberately replied as though he was in a dilemma. "I'm asking you on behalf of Civilas Yard. This has nothing to do with a confidentiality agreement." Isengard rubbed the pipe with his thumb. "A pound? How about 2 pounds? Having learned a lesson from the previous incident with Mersault, together with the fact that there was no need to keep it a secret, Klein replied without hesitation, "Sure." "All right." Isengard smiled and took out 2 one-pound notes from his pocket. Klein acted as though he was recalling something before frankly saying, "We only heard one sentence." "Ma'am Lopez attempted to order her subordinates to tell Capum that he's not to send anyone over in the next few days." "Capum?" Isengard nodded, seemingly enlightened. "Got it. You know Capum?" Klein didn't hide his surprise. Isengard handed the notes over and said with a faint smile, "He's one of the most controversial magnates in Sherwood Borough. In Backland, innocent girls often go missing along deserted streets, and after a long time, they might be chanced upon in all sorts of legal or illegal brothels. A lot of rumors point to Capum as the criminal honcho filled with blood and filth on his hands, but due to a lack of evidence, he remains free to this date. Furthermore, he knows a lot of important people. If that's true, then this fellow should die 1,000 times over." Klein nodded, sighed, and said, "This is Lowen. This is Backland. Mr. Stanton, I shall bid you farewell. Thank you for your cooperation." Isengard got up midway as a polite gesture to send him off. "By the way, your fighting skills are excellent. Maybe we'll have a chance to work together in the future. How should I address you?" "Sherlock Moriarty," Klein answered briefly and got off the carriage. Only when he boarded a newly arrived tracked carriage did Isengard Stanton instruct his assistant to close the door and order the carriage driver to head towards Hillston Borough. Turning his head to the side, he looked out of the window. The grey-haired elderly gentleman had put away his dark pipe, pulled out a brass ornament from his pocket, slowly stroking it in his hand. The brass ornament was a pocket-sized open book with a vertical eye in the center. The appearance and get-up of Mr. Moriarty from just now were a bit out of place. He wore very cultured gold-rimmed glasses, but he had deliberately grown a beard around his mouth, making him look crude and barbaric. This is not quite in line with the norm. In this day and age, people who wear gold-rimmed glasses tend to care a lot about their image, the image of having knowledge and bearing. Maybe he's trying to hide something. Of course, it's also possible that he's a gentleman with an unusual aesthetic sense. Isengard seemed to be talking to himself, but he also seemed to be teaching his assistant. At that moment, Klein, who was sitting on the carriage, mumbled to himself silently as he leaned against the wall, "That Detective Isengard Stanton is problematic. Ever since I activated my spirit vision, he had a blue color of rational thought and indifference and maintained a purple color of spirituality dominance. There weren't many other colors of emotion appearing. For normal people, unless they're wholeheartedly focused on studying a difficult problem, it's very difficult to maintain similar states for extended periods of time. Other emotions will inevitably appear, the difference being the issue of how long they can remain in that state. Yes, either Detective Isengard Stanton is one such genius at observation and reasoning with extraordinary talent, or he's a Beander." The tracked public carriage had 2 floors as it ferried more than 40 passengers towards the Backland Bridge area. Klein gradually reined in his thoughts and cast his gaze out the window and admired the 2 to 3 story buildings on the other side of the road. Occasionally he could see brown houses 5 or 6 stories high, a sign of Backland's latest trend and of the kingdom's most advanced construction technology. After a transfer, Klein arrived at Iron Gate Street and got off the carriage opposite the Bravehearts bar. As it wasn't the peak period at the bar yet, the moment he entered, he saw Kaspars drinking at the bar. The old man with the brandy nose had requested for a glass of Langsky Proof. His eyes narrowed in satisfaction as he savored the fragrance of the malt and the burning sensation in his throat. Klein moved closer, rapped the counter, and asked with a smile, "Is Marich here?" At the same time, he had one hand in his pocket as he gripped Azek's copper whistle, using his spirituality to shield its negative effects. Before he finished his sentence, he felt gazes sweep past him. It was evident that they were observing him. By the time he finished asking his question, the gazes moved away from him and focused on Kaspars. The old man with the huge scar on his face opened his eyes, and when he saw that it was Klein, he said in a bad mood, "He didn't come. He didn't come yesterday either. He didn't come." Klein let out a breath of relief, no longer using his spirituality to rap Azek's copper whistle. "When I mentioned Marich, someone looked at me. When they heard that I was asking him for his whereabouts, the gaze shifted again. Someone is also looking for Marich." Klein resisted the urge to turn around and observe as he analyzed the abnormality. Combined with an original doubt of his, he felt that the question now had a general answer to it. "I was puzzled last week. Why would a Sequence 5 Miss Bodyguard accept a 3-day protection mission for £1,000? This isn't to say that the price is too low, but rather that someone of that level already counts as a powerful person. In the Church of the Goddess, she's qualified to be a Nighthawk deacon or a diocese bishop. If she can gain the favor of a holy artifact, she can even compete for the position of an archbishop or a high-ranking deacon. Among the various secret organizations and intelligence agencies, Sequence 5 also implies that the person would be the person in charge of a borough or at least the number 2 or 3. Even if it were a Beander who isn't a part of any organization, a person with such strength would be able to establish a small organization of their own. No matter which point of view it was from, Miss Bodyguard could enjoy tributes from her subordinates, so there was no need for her to personally take the job. At the time, I thought that I had most likely hired a Sequence 6 security guard, who would be able to last a little longer against the expert sent by Bakerland, creating a chance for me, but who knew that Miss Bodyguard would be so terrifyingly strong. Judging from today's events, Miss Bodyguard and Marich are probably similar to me. Their identities are sensitive, and they have to hide away. Yes, their situation might be even worse, and they have to constantly worry about being hunted down. TCH, to be able to hunt Miss Bodyguard, even if that organization doesn't have any high Sequence Beyonders, they must have some holy artifacts or multiple Sequence 5 members. Of course, this is just my hunch. Perhaps it has to do with the exposure of Marich as a Beander and he's now targeted by the Machinery Hivemind Squad. After some thought, Klein said with regret, "Is that so? I was planning on playing cards with him." Upon hearing something that didn't match Klein's usual manner of speech, Kaspars was alarmed. He didn't look around either, but chortled and said, "I'll be having a card game tonight." "Texas, do you want to join in?" "No, I just want to play till dinner." "Sigh, I think I'll just head home." Klein sighed and left the Bravehearts bar without even ordering anything to drink. He had intended to ask Kaspars about other Beyonder gatherings, but in that situation, he carefully abandoned the idea. In fact, he could have gone to a cardroom or some relatively sealed area to talk with Kaspars, but just to be safe, he decided to wait until next time. Klein was in no hurry to return home. Instead, he went to the one-bedroom apartment he rented in East Borough and started divining above the grey fog to confirm that no one was following him. After easing his mind, he reached Minsk Street before it was completely dark and found all sorts of subscribed newspapers crammed into his mailbox. I was in a hurry to leave today, so I didn't even have time to read it. At the Quelaag Club, I had a good meal after shooting practice and took a nap, before being forced to play a few tennis matches with Talum. Hey, my skills aren't good enough, but my physical fitness can make up for that. He mumbled silently as he opened the door and went inside before twisting the gas lock. He brought the newspapers into the living room and sat on the sofa. He lit the wall lamp and started reading. Klein first read through the Backland Morning Post and immediately flipped to the 5th page and saw an advertisement. It was an advertisement for the Ernst firm's purchase of goods. The prices were 7 pence per litre of flour, 1 solely of butter, 6 pence per pound of lard, 1 solely 3 pence per pound of cream, 8 solely per pound of Marquis black tea. In other words, there would be a Beyonder gathering in the same place at 8 in the evening tomorrow. The code to the door is to knock 7 times heavily, 1 time lightly, 6 long intervals, and 1 short interval in that order. The remaining 3 and 8 are meaningless. Klein interpreted the content, leaned back against the sofa, and began to look forward to the gathering tomorrow evening. He wanted to sell some formulas to see if he could buy the corresponding ingredients or items. Wednesday night, 5 minutes to 8. In an alley behind Bravehearts bar. Klein circled around for a while based on his memories before finally finding the house with the dark candlelights. He was disguised today in a grayish-blue worker's uniform, cap, and a beard so that no one would connect him to the guy who had tried his luck by buying Black Snake's item. It would be best if Eye of Wisdom and the apothecary don't recognize me. Otherwise, a newbie who had relied on luck to become a Beyonder and was able to come up with several potions after a week would definitely be suspicious. Klein put his hands in his pockets and felt for Azek's copper whistle, the ordinary tarot cards, and the charms he had replenished. His uniform was specially modified by a tailor. There were many small pockets with metal bottles filled with herbs powder and extract essence. After taking a deep breath and slowly exhaling, Klein took out the metal mask that could only cover half his face and finished the first step to his disguise. Following that, he used the clown's ability to control his facial expression and his physical tics, as well as his gait while numbing his facial nerves. He wanted to be vastly different from his previous self. However, I'm not sure what Eye of Wisdom relies on to recognize people. This is all I can do. Sigh, if only I was already a faceless. But if that's the case, I wouldn't need to join such low-level Beyonder gatherings. Klein stood outside the door in silence for a few seconds. He then raised his right hand and knocked on the door, 7 hard knocks and 1 light one, with 6 long pauses and 1 short pause in between. Almost without waiting, the small wooden board on the door was silently pulled open, and an eye appeared behind it. It examined the visitor from head to toe. 2 or 3 seconds later, the door creaked open and Eye of Wisdom's attendant handed a hooded black robe to Klein. Klein maintained his emotionless state as he quickly put on the robe and pulled down his hood, letting the shadows cover his face. On the way to the living room, he deliberately took steps he wasn't used to and tried his hardest to eliminate the awkwardness. There was only 1 candle in the dark and silent room and quite a number of members at the gathering. Klein didn't choose a corner like the previous time. Instead, he sat on a high stool right in the center. In short, he wanted everything about his external appearance and behavior to be completely different from the previous 2 times. And it was precisely due to his identity as a clown that gave him this domain of expertise, allowing him to reflect his own body into his mind and gain fundamental control over it. The living room was so silent that it appeared frozen. Time passed by, and finally, Eye of Wisdom looked at the clock on the wall and said in his ancient voice, "It's time. Let's begin. We don't need to wait for our late friends." Just as he finished his sentence, Klein immediately said with a hoarse voice, "I want to sell potion formulas. They are Sequence 9 Bard and Sequence 8 Light Suppliant from the Church of the Eternal Blazing Sun. The former is £220 and the latter is £450. This was the most suitable plan that he could come up with after much consideration. The Spectator and the Telepathus potions were related to the Psychology Alchemists, a secret organization that was still active in Backland in the Loan Kingdom. If he recklessly produced them, he might attract their attention. And the Church of Eternal Blazing Sun was blocked out by the Church of the Lord of Storms, so the corresponding Beyonders rarely appeared in Backland and could do very little. Therefore, it was an extremely safe choice. The potion of the seer pathway involved Klein himself, and he certainly didn't want to reveal his characteristics. After having experienced so many battles and watched so many battles with Beyonders, he gradually came to understand something. It was that below the high sequences, Beyonders of different pathways had their own characteristics which didn't overlap. That was to say, each of them had their own strengths and weaknesses, and their strengths and weaknesses were all very obvious. The strengths were indeed strong, and the weaknesses were indeed weak. For example, the spectator pathway lacked the ability to fight in actual combat, but if they were ignored and were unconsciously misled, then no matter how strong an opponent's combat skills were, it was possible for them to die without knowing why. A clear example would be Hurricane Rear Admiral Kilongos, who clearly possessed the mystical item, Creeping Hunger, and had an overall combat strength of a Sequence 5, but he still died in a rather inexplicable manner. Most of this was thanks to Azek, but one couldn't dismiss the role of the spectator. Due to the fact that the majority of the Beyonder jobs below the high sequence had distinct characteristics and obvious weaknesses with weak bodies, if one could conceal one's strengths and understand the situation of their enemies beforehand, it wasn't impossible for them to defeat someone stronger. In extreme cases, there was still a very small chance of a Sequence 9 killing a Sequence 5. Of course, this was a perfect hypothesis, but in reality, it was almost impossible. Sequence 5 was already considered strong, and the corresponding Beyonder powers could be considered miraculous. Strengths could effectively cover up weaknesses, but before reaching Sequence 6, it was very difficult to cause any effect on them. On the other hand, many of the Beyonders below high sequences were very afraid of being attacked by a group, even if their opponents were all below their own sequence. This was because once one became flustered, their attempts to avoid a fault would lead to failure of another. Their weaknesses could lead to fatal outcomes. These problems were why shepherds were ranked first below high sequences. They were so all-rounded that if they combined and matched their Beyonder powers well enough, they would almost have zero shortcomings. After I advance to the Sequence 7, I'll have all sorts of magical Beyonder powers. Then, even if I encounter a Sequence 6, I'll be able to contend against them for a while, and I might even be able to win. If I encounter a Sequence 5, there might still be a chance of escaping. As his thoughts raced, Klein looked around, waiting for someone to speak. If Bard and Light Suppliant can't be sold, then I can only go for second best and consider selling Spectator and Telepathus. In consideration of Beyonder characteristics, indestructibility and conservation, the formula of my own pathway definitely shouldn't be sold. The witch pathway wouldn't as well, for it would lead to many tragic cases. Whether it's instigator or witch, they're the type that necessitates committing evil deeds. Klein was a little nervous, but his face remained expressionless as he waited. Actually, I can consider buying it. At that moment, the chubby apothecary laughed. I can also accept another apprentice and give him these two formulas, making him specialize in praying for light to shine on my herbs. Perfect. How extravagant. His words broke the momentary silence in the room. A man in the corner, who had his hood pulled very low, spoke in a deliberately sharp voice. Perhaps I can give it to my child. At least it's stronger than my sequence. Sequence 9, 200 pounds, Sequence 8, 400 pounds. If you agree, we have a deal. To be able to take out 600 pounds at one go means he's quite rich. That's enough to buy a house in Tingen City. Klein pretended to think, looked at the other members at the gathering, and observed their reactions. Noticing that no one had the urge to raise the price, and that the other party's bid had reached his bottom line, Klein thought for a while and said, I'll tag on an additional request. You cannot sell these two formulas in this gathering, but you are free to do as you wish elsewhere. The man said sharply, all right, Mr. Eye of Wisdom will bear witness. Klein didn't know how to prove that the formula was real, but he didn't want to ask as it would expose the fact that he hadn't participated in many gatherings. Therefore, he silently pulled up his robe and took out the two potion formulas he had written long ago and handed it to an attendant beside him. The attendant didn't walk to the corner. Instead, he went to the single sofa in the center and handed the folded paper over to the Eye of Wisdom. The old gentleman spread out the paper and, without taking an extra look at it, placed it on a small round table beside him. Then, he took out a handkerchief and wiped his right palm. From his pocket, he took out a ring inlaid with many tiny diamonds. This ring was complicated and exquisite in design. In the middle of the ring was a dark green gem that looked like an eye. Just by looking at it from a distance, Klein felt his head swell and his body turn uncomfortable. It was just like back when he was taking his math examination. Eye of Wisdom solemnly wore the ring on his right middle finger and then closed his eyes, as if he was preparing something. Suddenly, the emerald green gem on the ring bloomed with a resplendent golden color which was as bright as the sun. Eye of Wisdom quickly extended his right hand and let the gem touch the potion formula written by Klein. The rays of golden light became purer until they eventually turned into a holographic projection. Authentic and effective, Eye of Wisdom announced in a low voice. He immediately removed the ring from his finger, not daring to wear it for another second. His tone sounds just like a notary. That ring is the most prized item in Mr. Eye of Wisdom's collection, sealed artifact 2081? It emulates the powers of a notary? Klein watched on thoughtfully, feeling a little covetous. After the notarization, the deal was quickly concluded, and Klein received a thick wad of cash, all in 10-pound notes. After counting the bills 3 times, he didn't fold and put them in his pocket. Instead, he held them in the palm of his hand and waited for an opportunity to spend them. He planned on observing for a moment to ensure that there was nothing he needed before speaking again to mention his desire to purchase things. At that moment, the apothecary looked around and said, "I brought a few bottles of sedatives." He really brought it? I've already forgotten all about it. In order to be different from his past self, Klein could only pretend that he wasn't around. After shouting a few times and seeing that there was no response, the apothecary muttered, "That guy didn't come this time? Maybe he's dead somewhere. Thank you for your blessings. But it's delightful that you failed to recognize me." Klein heaved a sigh of relief. The apothecary habitually asked for Spring of the Elves marrow crystals again, but it was in vain as usual. Moments after he shut up, a woman whose face was completely shrouded by her hood said with 2 boxes at her feet, "I have 2 weapons with Beander effects. This must be the lady who sold the inscribed steel sword the last time, right? My spirituality instincts as a seer tells me that she has another 2 similar weapons. Backing her is some Beander armament organization, right? Well, maybe she has an artisan behind her, also known as Sequence 6 of the Machinery Specialist and Savon Pathway." Klein looked over with anticipation. He had agreed to give the son a Beander weapon worth 500 to 700 pounds, which could effectively his combat ability. He didn't promise the specific type and characteristics, so long as it was similar and could be used, he could buy it. In any case, the son wasn't picky about it. The woman with the hooded face looked around her and said, "The 2 weapons this time are easy to carry around. One of them is the Whip of Slowness. It's a replica of a particular mystical item. It can constantly create formless restraints, influencing your opponent bit by bit, slowing down his actions gradually. The longer you last in battle, the more effective it would be. It can still be used for 2 years. 450 pounds, or the potion formula for Barbarian. This whip sounds pretty good, and it feels like the spider silk ability of the Demoness of Pleasure. However, would it seem a little strange for Little Sun to use a whip?" Klein asked in a hoarse voice, "Can this invisible binding effect affect spirit-type creatures? For example, wraiths?" The lady shook her head slowly. "No." Without waiting for any further questions, she continued introducing, "The second weapon is called the Axe of Hurricane. It can raise the user's agility and running speed. There's also a 15% chance of inflicting a numbing effect to the enemy and a 5% chance of producing a bolt of lightning. If used in a thunderstorm, the chance of the lightning bolt will be raised to 50%. This has all been verified through experimentation and concluded through copious amounts of data. This weapon's effects can last for no more than a year. 520 pounds or the potion formula to Barbarian. This is much stronger than the Whip of Slowness. If it wasn't for the fact that it only has the Beander effects for a year, it probably wouldn't be this price." "Right. According to the description of Little Sun and the scene I vaguely saw, in the air above the City of Silver and the surrounding area, there are always flashes of lightning. The highest frequency is during daytime and the lowest frequency is during nighttime. This is very similar to a so-called thunderstorm environment. If it's really effective, then this Axe of Hurricane would be a truly mystical item in the hands of Little Sun. Each strike has a 50% chance of blasting out lightning. It would be absolutely formidable. Even if that doesn't work, looking at the most basic Beander effects of the Axe of Hurricane, it's still quite a good weapon, and it meets the needs of Little Sun. As for the problem that it can only be used for a year, it's not a big problem to solve." In 1 year, with Little Sun's digestion rate and City of Silver's Beyonder resources, as long as he has the potion formulas, he would at least be sequence 6 by then. At that point in time, he'll definitely need to replace his weapon. As his mind whirled, Klein basically determined that he was buying the Axe of Hurricane. At that moment, the apothecary muttered, "Is an axe easy to carry around? I feel like I've heard a joke, and I think it might be more appropriate to make a wrench. Say, can't you sell stuff like revolvers with Beyonder effects? I will try my best to collect similar items." The woman emphasized the word collect. "All right, friends who are willing to buy one of these weapons, please make a bid." Before Klein could even speak, he heard a male voice from the long sofa. "Axe of Hurricane, £520. The woman waited a few seconds before asking again, "Is there anyone else who wants to bid?" £530. Klein added £10. The man immediately replied, £550. Ellipsis. "This, Little Sun, if he raises it to more than £600, I won't be buying it. I'll get you a new whip." With a definite strategy in mind, Klein called out very calmly, £560. He tried to make it appear that no matter what offer was made, he could add on an additional £10. And the £600 he had just earned was just enough to put invisible pressure on the other party. Upon hearing the latest price, the man fell silent and shrugged. "All right then, it's yours." Phew, Klein secretly heaved a sigh of relief. "Is there anyone else who wants to bid for the Axe of Hurricane?" the woman asked again, but the room was silent. "Sold." The lady didn't hesitate any longer and handed the box next to her right foot to the attendant. The attendant had the eye of wisdom appraise it before bringing it to Klein. Money was handed over in exchange for the item. Putting away the remaining 4 £10 notes, Klein opened the box and saw an axe that could be attached to one's back or tucked in one's belt. Its entire body was iron black in color, thick, and sturdy, with a sharp edge. In his spirit vision, it was clear that the creator had used a large number of spiritual materials. There were also many symbols and magic runes on the surface of the axe. They were embedded inside, turning into lightning and hurricane patterns. When Klein reached out to touch it, he felt a faint pricking pain. He nodded and placed the box on his lap. "It can be exchanged for the true root and juice of a mistrent. My magician potion is only missing the spinal fluid of a dark patterned Black Panther. I've made a good deal of money in my past few commissions, and together with my original savings and what I just have left, I have £209 5 solis and 5 pennies on me. The Beyonder ingredients corresponding to sequence 7 are valued at £500 to £700. Hey, I still had to sell formulas or knowledge. Yes, I'll take the time to check on Leopard this week and confirm the progress of his bicycle." Klein stopped bidding and quietly watched from the sidelines. Later on, someone bought the Whip of Slowness for £480, and a Beyonder ingredient called Heart of Featherman wasn't sold because its price reached £1,600 and nobody wanted it. According to his knowledge of mysticism, Klein knew that this Beyonder ingredient would be classified in the category of sequence 6. In the following transactions, more failed than succeeded. After all, most of the Beyonders who came to the gathering had a specific purpose, and they wouldn't casually waste money and resources. They weren't like Klein, who bought any weapon as long as the Beyonder effects were good enough. "I want to sell a formula potion. Sequence 9, Corpse Collector. £230. Towards the end, a man sitting quietly in a corner said with a deep voice, "Corpse Collector? I remember that this potion formula can only be found in the Church of the Evernight Goddess, Church of the God of Combat, and the Numinous Episcopate. Has an undercover Nighthawk sneaked in, or is he a member of the Numinous Episcopate who's trying to revive death? Of course, it isn't that strange for low-sequence formulas to be found in the wild. This isn't a huge secret. I remember old Neil mentioning that the formula for Corpse Collector involved a desiccated black-spotted frog." Klein controlled himself and didn't smile. He thoughtfully looked ahead and discovered that the potion formula of Corpse Collector was quickly sold. The potion formula for sequence 9 is very easy to sell. Before, there was just a single sequence 8 Folk of Rage formula that failed to close several times, while my light suppliant formula matched with sequence 9 Bard was sold relatively easily. Yes, most Beyonders would collect sequence 9 formulas if they have the money to spare. They can give their own children and students more opportunities to choose from, allowing them to walk a path that they preferred. Under this premise, if a sequence 8 formula doesn't have the foundation sequence 9, they would have to wait for Beyonders who are attempting to advance, and there might not even be one in 1 to 2 years. After all, the circle of Beyonders is very scattered, and most people don't know about the acting method. Yes, they also don't know the law of Beyonder characteristics conservation and indestructibility. Klein silently thought and didn't speak. After another 15 minutes, seeing that the gathering was about to end, he asked probingly, "Who has the complete spinal fluid of a dark-patterned Black Panther?" Silence. No one spoke in the living room. Klein thought for a moment, then added, "I will provide payment that no Beyonder would refuse. For example, the law of Beyonder characteristics conservation and indestructibility. Unfortunately, I've already sworn to the goddess that I wouldn't impart the acting method to anyone else. I've already died once. I wonder if that oath is invalid." Klein forcefully retracted his scattered thoughts, but he still didn't hear anyone speak. "Okay, next." He deliberately made a shrug that he wouldn't normally do. The apothecary cleared his throat and said, "I've brought quite a few of my own medicine. Take a look at what you want. It's not expensive at all. It's just a few pounds or even a few soli." When the lady selling Beyonder weapons heard this, she asked curiously, "I want to know if the dangerous beast in the sewers has been eliminated?" The apothecary snorted immediately. "You asked the right person." After saying that, he spread out his hands. "I don't know either. After I got someone to make a police report, I haven't been to the sewers ever since." "Bro, you're asking for a beating. It must have been hard for you to grow up so healthily. From the looks of it, it was very wise of you to choose the apothecary job." Klein couldn't help but lampoon in Chinese. The woman took a deep breath and slowly exhaled without saying a word. When all the strange medicine the apothecary had brought were sold, Eye of Wisdom announced that the gathering was over. He delegated Klein to be fifth to leave, through a secret passage in the basement. From the looks of it, Eye of Wisdom didn't recognize me either. With some relief, Klein took off his hooded robe and tossed it to the attendant. Then, he walked out of the passage and skillfully circled around it. After confirming that no one was following him, he took off his iron mask, left the secluded street, took the box containing the axe of Hurricane, and headed straight to East Borough. There were no gas lamps on Black Palm Street in East Borough, and after dark, it was like an abyss. In a particular apartment here, Klein sealed the room with a wall of spirituality, then he summoned himself and carried the axe of Hurricane above the grey fog. If it had been a little heavier, I wouldn't have been able to carry it with me even if I had Mr. Azek's copper whistle to reinforce my spirit. Then, I would have to switch to a sacrificial ritual. Klein mumbled, sending his thoughts to the illusory star corresponding to the sun. "The world has sacrificed the weapon to me. You can prepare the bestowment ritual." Ellipsis. City of Silver. Upon seeing the grey fog and hearing Mr. Fool's instructions, Derek Berg immediately sat up and rushed to prepare. Before holding the bestowment ceremony, he silently took out his knight's sword and made a few vertical slashes to ease his anticipation. Would it be a straight sword, a broadsword, or a rapier? Derek stopped without realizing, unable to stop himself from thinking, and subconsciously pictured himself using that powerful weapon. After a while, during the ritual, he saw the Beyonder weapon that belonged to him. It was an axe. "Dear Mr. Fool, please tell Mr. World that I'll try to gather the miscreant's true root and juice as soon as possible." After receiving the son's reply, Klein nodded indiscernibly and muttered to himself, "From the looks of it, he's rather satisfied with the weapon." Even without the additional effects from the environment, the axe of Hurricane is still quite a formidable weapon. He had passed the information regarding the Beyonder weapon's characteristics and limitations to the son. He didn't describe it directly in order to avoid sounding naggy. He needed to maintain his image. After doing all of this, Klein didn't stay any longer and immediately returned to the real world, changed his clothes, and left Black Palm Street. East Borough, Dharavi Street, in a cramped but lively pub. Zio de Recha covered her nose and mouth as she squeezed in. To her, what was bad about this place wasn't just because it smelled of alcohol and sweat, but that she would easily encounter people much taller than she was. She had to face their armpits and the strong odor was nauseating. Using a great deal of effort and even using the powers of an arbiter, Zio finally squeezed her way to the bar counter and saw the man she was looking for. It was a young man in his 20s. He had a face as long and thin as a horse. His eyebrows were messy and ferocious, but his facial features were relatively soft. He was gulping down alcohol and laughing loudly with the patrons around him. "Williams, I have something to talk to you about." Zio banged on the wooden counter. This boorish action immediately attracted many angry gazes. However, they quickly retreated under the stern gaze of an arbiter. "Oh, Zio, I haven't seen you in days. Let me see, it's been a week, no, at least 3 weeks. Care for a drink? Half and half, Williams said, half drunk and half surprised. Half and half was one of the most popular alcoholic beverages in East Borough, made from malt beer and fortified grape wine, and because it has precisely made up of two constituents of equal proportion, it was known as half and half. Are you really going to let me drink? Zio pricked up her brows. No, he doesn't, the boss, who was wiping the glasses, hurriedly answered on Williams's behalf. He clearly remembered how deadly the girl would become when she got drunk. She would use her fists to persuade the guests to quit drinking and throw them out one by one. The corner of Williams's mouth twitched as he spread out his hands and said, "Go on, why are you looking for me?" He was one of East Borough's informants and was connected to several gangs. Zio frowned and said, "Williams, can't you quit drinking? Save your money, marry a nice girl, and come home every day to hot water, food, and warm greetings. You can share all the things you've seen in the day with her, and she can tell you about the trivial things that happened in your house, and there will be cute kids who will kiss you on the cheek and play around you. Isn't such warmth nice?" She was able to gain a quick foothold in Backlands East Borough, all thanks to Williams's help, so she had always wanted him to be better off. Warmth? Williams scoffed. It's built on the money I bring back, and I've seen through the farce. If I could bring home 20 soldi a week, I'm sure my family would be warm and just as you described it to be, but if not, Lord, the screams and insults from the woman, the cries and shrieks of children, would drive me crazy. My mom is a good example. Every time my old man comes home, he'll beat me up and make a ruckus, so if that's the case, I might as well use the soldi and the pence on me to trade for drinks. No one cares how much I earn here, everyone drinks and chats, and the mood is really good. If I want women, there are cute street girls outside. They wouldn't quarrel with you. Zio smirked and said, "You really are an incorrigible believer of the Lord of Storms. One day, you'll die from alcoholism or some strange disease. At least I've enjoyed life," Williams replied without minding what she said. "I haven't worked in almost 3 days, so I'm not going to give you a discount." Zio stopped persuading him. She stroked her short, disheveled blonde hair and handed him the portrait of Lenivis that Audrey had given her. "Help me keep an eye out for this man. Find him as soon as possible. Here are different portraits of him." William spread out the piece of paper in his stupor and glanced at it before T.S. King. "He looks too ordinary, and there are so many people in East Borough. There are people who die at any moment. Some leave, some come, and others become vagrants. It'll be difficult to find him. In short, help me keep an eye out. Notify me immediately if you find anyone who looks like him." Zio took out a 5 soldi bill and handed it to him. "Here's some beer money. If you can find the person in the portrait, I'll, give you another £10. £10? Williams whistled. "Zio, when did you become so generous? Or is this person worth more? That's how much his reward is worth. £10 for providing clues." Zio pretended to look around the pub and answered, "Don't forget about this matter, I'll come back in a few days' time." She had already run through nearly half of East Borough and issued the mission to the gang leaders and informants she knew, and she had paid several pounds in advance. "As long one of them succeeds, I'll earn it all back. All those profits." Zio silently cheered herself on and walked out of the pub with her nose and mouth covered. At that moment, the scene gradually turned chaotic due to some conflict between a few drunkards. Zio glanced over in exasperation, then raised her voice and shouted, "Stop!" A sense of dominance reverberated within the pub, and it was as though the drunkards had met their nemesis as they hurriedly sat down. Some of them even hugged their heads and squatted on the ground. "Phew, I wonder when I'll advance to sheriff." Zio sighed, feeling a mix of satisfaction and anticipation. On Thursday morning, Klein took the long trip to St. George Borough, which was like another city altogether, to show some concern for his first investment. With his last tip and the revelation from Russell's manuscript, Leopard was progressing very quickly on the bicycle project and had already built a crude prototype. This was very much in line with Klein's impression of bicycles. After a trial ride, Klein offered a few suggestions for improvements, saying he would disburse the second investment payment next week, and expressed his hope of bringing in new investors as soon as possible, so that the project could enter an industrial phase. The only problem was that Leopard believed that he was the inventor and had the right to name the product. He wasn't satisfied with the term bicycle, and intended to adopt the more popular term bike. Klein didn't care. At noon, he returned to 15 Minsk Street, but before he could take off his hat, he heard a series of illusory pleas. "Miss Justice? She has collected the information on the abject nobles so quickly? Still in thought, Klein prepared to enter the living room and head to the second floor. At that moment he heard the doorbell, and when he opened the door, he saw Julianne, the maid from the Sammers next door. "Mr. Moriarty, Mrs. Sammer would like to invite you to a Sunday luncheon. There will be a lot of neighbors attending," the maid said as if she was reciting something. After his return last night, Klein had handed the portable camera to Mrs. Sammer and exchanged a few words with her, but he hadn't received any indication of a luncheon. That's right. According to the magazines, the middle class wouldn't invite anyone to an event in person, but instead, they formally sent their servants or maids to send the invitation. This is in line with Mrs. Sammer's style. Klein was puzzled at first before he immediately came to a realization, so he promised to punctually attend on Sunday. Who wouldn't want to have a free lunch? And Mr. and Mrs. Sammer aren't very difficult people to get along with, as long as you don't mind their showing off. Klein secretly added in his heart. He watched as Julianne left. He closed the door behind him and walked toward the stairs, his eyes scanning the slightly messy living room, dining room, and kitchen. It's been a few days since I've cleaned up. I'm a bachelor, so it's not bad that I'm able to maintain a level of tidiness such as this. I have too many secrets, and I might even suffer an attack. It's not too good to just hire an in-house maidservant for chores. Yes, I should discuss this with Mrs. Sammer on Sunday and ask her to send her maid to clean up twice a week, and I'll pay for it. Many tenants and landlords have had similar agreements. Klein calmly walked into the bedroom on the second floor and drew the curtains. After entering the fog, he found that the prayer had indeed come from Miss Justice. This girl of blue blood sat on a piano stool, her hands on the keys. She wasn't playing the piano. Instead, she was whispering the honorific name of the fool that doesn't belong to this era. I've gathered the information regarding the abject nobles. I'm requesting permission to hold a sacrificial ritual and seek your help in passing it to Mr. World. That's quick, as expected of a professional. Klein immediately responded. Audrey, who had just returned from the Royal Coat of Arms office and experts in this field, completed the sacrificial ritual with a little unfamiliarity as she threw the thick manuscript into the illusory door. I'll pass it to the world. Klein's tone was indifferent as he cut off the connection. This time, he was in no hurry to return to the real world. Instead, he flipped through the manuscript and found the part pertaining to the Pound family. The Pound family had indeed obtained the title of Viscount from the Battle of the Violated Oath. After that, they were loyal to the royal family, and they had quite a bit of power in the army and their own fiefdom. However, 32 years ago, two of the family's heirs died from serious illnesses, one after another. At that time, the old Viscount had no choice but to bring the child of a distant relative home. Not long after, the old Viscount passed away. As the child was still young, under the enticement and instigation of the servants, he changed the butler and turned foppish. In just 8 years he had lost most of his fortune and was reduced to a baron. Even the family's house in Backland was sold. In the years that followed, his title was reduced once again to that of a baronet. Died of serious illnesses? Their corpses are probably nowhere to be found. They should all be in that innermost room in the underground structure, outside that bloody door. The old Viscount must have deliberately concealed the matter, preventing the royal family, military or churches to investigate. From the looks of it, the Pound family must have discovered the underground structure from the Fourth Epoch about 30 years ago. Perhaps the underground secret door was built by them, but there are more than 2 corpses in that room. There were others who had entered in ancient times to probe the area? Well, I'll have to talk to Baronet Pound in a way that won't reveal my identity. Klein stopped thinking and looked at the last paragraph. He saw what he wanted. Baronet Pound, currently living at 29 Civilas Street, Empress Borough. Civilas Prefecture was located west of the Loan Kingdom, across the Hornassus mountain range from the Intis Republic. And in Backland, there was a street named after it, on the edge of Empress Borough, where the headquarters of the capital's police department was located. Many people chose to settle down here for the peace of mind, and Rafter Pound was one of them. The baronet stood by the closed window in his warm activity room at Unit 29, in his cotton-quilted pajamas, staring diagonally across the street at Civilas Yard. He was in his early 40s, but the sides of his hair had turned white. He had puffy eyes and clear wrinkles on his face. His body constantly emitted the smell of alcohol. On the floor behind Rafter lay some torn lingerie, and opposite it was a burning fireplace. The baronet raised his glass and gulped the rest of the liquid in it. Then, he walked slowly to the door and returned to his bedroom to get some sleep. As there was no pipe to transfer the heat from the fireplace, he felt the bone-chilling chill of late autumn as soon as he left the activity room. Damn it! Rafter Pound cursed under his breath as he staggered to the bedroom door and twisted the handle. The bedroom was dark, with only a faint crimson glow shining in. Rafter was about to close the door behind him and collapse into bed when his eyes suddenly froze. A figure was sitting quietly on a chair beside the curtain. The figure wore a pair of grayish-blue pants and a cap. The entire person was completely hidden in the shadows. Sensing Baronet Pound's gaze, the man slowly raised his head and looked over. His face was painted red, yellow, and white, looking like the funniest clown. Rafter was about to shout and run when he saw a revolver aimed at him and heard two deep and hoarse sentences. I advise you not to do anything unwise. If you cooperate, I won't harm you, and I won't take away your belongings, if you still have any left. Rafter Pound's expression changed a few times, and he very obediently closed the bedroom door. Then, he half raised his hands and sat on the edge of the bed. What do you want from me? He hiccuped in his drunken stupor, and his body trembled slightly as he reminded, Civilas Yard is just across the street. I know, but I think I'm closer to you than you are to Civilas Yard. Disguised as a clown, Klein had changed his voice and tone as he warned, and my purpose is just to ask you a few questions. Before he came to Civilas Street, he had divined if there would be any danger in making this trip in the mysterious space above the grey fog and had obtained an answer that it was very safe. Questions? Rafter's lips trembled as laughed bitterly. Here we go again. Am I never going to escape this nightmare? Have there been many people coming to you with questions? Klein continued the topic. No, not only questions. After my uncle, the Honourable Old Viscount, passed away, too many things have happened to me. The amiable old butler resigned for no reason and has vanished. Those servants and maids would change one after the other without warning, becoming unfamiliar and cold. They were looking for something, yes, they were looking for something, I wasn't even 10 back then. All I could do was watch, and I didn't dare tell anyone. I was afraid that I would never wake up again. Rafter replied as though he was on the brink of collapse. Looking for something? Were they searching for the underground structure, or the treasures of the Pound family, such as the Beander characteristics and mystical items buried near the evil spirit? The royal family and the churches must have realized this, as the higher-ups must know about the law of Beander characteristics conservation and indestructibility. Since the Pound family was in ruins, these things should have been taken back, right? Unless the old Viscount paid a huge price and bought some other rare Beander characteristics and mystical items of the same sequence to conceal the matter of the underground structure. After Klein finished listening quietly, he generated many guesses. He seemed relaxed, but in reality, he could attack at any time. How long has this been going on for? I don't know. There are faces around me that I don't know. How can I be sure that the remaining people aren't also in cahoots? I pretended not to notice anything. After trembling for a few years, I was enticed by them to do drinking, sex, gambling, smoking marijuana, and all sorts of things that make me look like a piece of trash. Rafter Pound gave a somewhat crazy laugh. They're finally relieved and are no longer watching me. When I sold that house, whoosh! All of them left, with no idea where they went. No, they must still be secretly monitoring me, preventing me from calling the police. Right, they aren't letting me call the police. This fellow has some mental illness. I have no idea if what he said is true or false. In his aura, the change in his mood colors adhere to logic, but what if he just feels that he had let down the old Viscount and fantasized a whole sequence of events like this to find an excuse for his degeneration? Later, he would keep telling himself that until he's utterly convinced. As a qualified keyboard warrior, Klein, who knew a little of everything, had seen similar cases in his previous life. After thinking for 2 seconds, he asked, "What did these people ask you?" "They asked me how the 2 children of the old Viscount died. They asked me what abnormal behavior the old Viscount had over the years. I wasn't even 10 years old at the time, so I don't know anything." Rafter waved his arms and growled under his breath. "Calm down, please calm down." Klein lowered his left hand and attempted to confirm if Baronet Pound knew of the underground structure via multiple angles. Time flew by as the question and answer session ensued. Klein said in a hoarse voice, "You really don't seem to know anything. I'm very sorry to bother you, but it's time for me to leave." He stood up, bowed slightly, and appeared very well-mannered. And almost at the same time, the excitement and appearance of having a breakdown on Rafter Pound's face vanished. His light blue eyes became abnormally deep, as though he was examining something. When he saw the intruder about to stand up straight, he immediately reverted back to his previous performance: grief, anger, madness, bitterness, and neuroticism. At that moment, a mysterious voice suddenly resounded in his ears. Crimson. Klein injected spirituality into a slumber charm and threw it at Rafter with his unarmed left hand. Amidst crisp crackling sounds, a strong sense of serenity spread out, enveloping the baronet, causing him to shut his eyes involuntarily and fall weakly onto the bed. I'm sorry. The questions from before are for the comparison of what shall ensue. Next, it's the process of entering your dream and spirit channeling. Klein patted Rafter's pajamas, and with his hand on his chest, he made another bow. Then, he used the dream charm and entered Rafter's dream like a nightmare. In the gray, fragmentary, constantly coruscating world, Klein soberly walked beside Rafter, watching him see the blank faces of the servants and maids who had no facial features as they gave off abnormal and frightening vibes. He saw Rafter turning his head only to always to see an old face silently gazing at him, watching him curl up in the corner, shivering, and him being enveloped by a shadow, little by little. This matches what he had described earlier. Klein tried to guide the dream to make sense of the situation, but it was as though Baronet Pound had a very serious psychological trauma over these matters. Any tiny bit of stimulation would cause him to scream and run like a madman in his dreams. This made it impossible for Klein to get any more information. Thus, he withdrew from the dream and cast another slumber charm on Rafter Pound before taking out a mantha extract and other materials, in preparation to channel his spirit in a mediumship ritual. After responding to himself, Klein's spirituality passed through the storm of thoughts and saw the illusory image of Rafter, an illusory image based on the body of heart and mind. What did the old Viscount say to you before he died? Klein hesitated for a moment before asking. Rafter Pound muddle-headedly replied, he wants me to maintain the family. What else? Klein asked again in a tone of deliberate affirmation. He wanted me to remember the glory of the ancestors, Rafter answered blankly. Klein nodded and asked, what were those people looking for? I don't know. Rafter gave the same answer. Klein continued asking and compared it with the answers Pound had said before, finally coming to the conclusion that Baronet Pound had not lied, and what he had just said was true. At this point, he didn't stay any longer. He passed through the storm of thoughts and allowed his extended spirituality to return to his body. Next, Klein methodically tidied up the scene and tossed Azek's copper whistle a few times, using its nature to interfere with any possible divination investigations. Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Baronet. After doing all of this, Klein bowed once again. Then he turned, opened the window, jumped into the street, and disappeared into the night. After a while, Rafter Pound suddenly opened his eyes. Around those light blue eyes, there was a circle of ruptured capillaries. He flipped himself up suddenly and stared at the open oriel window. After making a long detour to East Borough, Klein washed his disguise and changed into normal clothes. As if nothing had happened, he returned to 15 Minsk Street in Sherwood Borough. He didn't rest, nor did he think about what he should do with the underground structure. Instead, he once again entered the fog. At the very end of the ancient long table, Klein slowly opened his palm, revealing several strands of brown hair. They were Rafter Pound's hair he had gathered when Rafter was sleeping. There's still the final step, confirming with divination above the grey fog. Klein silently muttered to himself, then he conjured a pen and paper. He wrote down the content that he had already thought about beforehand. Rafter Pound's future. I want to see what will happen to you in the future so as to confirm the past. Klein leaned back in his chair and began to recite the divination statement. As the ancient structure involved the 6 orthodox gods, he was afraid that there would be problems if he divined something directly, so he changed his way of thinking and helped Rafter Pound ask about the future. Rafter Pound's future. Klein held onto the baronet's hair, closed his eyes, and entered a deep slumber with the help of cogitation. In the grey gloomy world, he saw a narrow, irregular cave. Rafter Pound, with his puffy eye bags and grey hair at his temples, was propping himself up on his elbows, crawling forward like a reptile to leave the hole. Then, with a flash, he retrieved a black iron emblem of unknown origins and wore it on his chest. The emblem had a scepter carved on it, as well as a hand that was holding onto the scepter tightly. Tutor. Klein jerked out of the dream and sat up. According to Miss Bodyguard's introduction, the black iron emblem was engraved with the imperial coat of arms of the Fourth Epoch's Tudor Empire royal household. It was identical to the one he had seen in the ancient structure. Rafter Pound is definitely not as simple as he seems to be. Klein rubbed his forehead and muttered to himself. As a seer, he had his own interpretation of the revelation he had received from the dream. On the one hand, he knew that it was something Rafter Pound would do in the future, and on the other hand, he believed that it meant that Rafter Pound had a deep connection with the Tudor family. Through the 3 tests of direct questioning, dream probing, and spirit channeling, Rafter Pound didn't expose any problems, nor did he make me notice that anything was amiss. If I didn't have a 4th test, I probably would have been deceived by him. Yes, maybe he really doesn't know anything at present and that it was a true act. In the future, he might even chance upon an opportunity to form a connection with the Tudor family. But it's more likely that he has already learned a lot from the old Viscount. Without confidence, he intentionally turned decadent and acted crazy and ignorant. For him to be able to hide from my dream and spirit channeling, it should be a result of some Beyonder powers. He probably wasn't acting at that time and was really in a muddled state. Otherwise, he would have exposed himself in front of a person like me who is very experienced in such matters. What Beyonder powers could it be? What sequence number is he? Or is he the kind that is born with certain Beyonder powers? Klein proceeded this line of thought and soon realized he had reached a dead end. He quickly pulled himself out of this dead end and changed his angle of thinking. Rafter Pound has a deep connection with the Tudor family. Can I make a bold hypothesis that he's actually a descendant of the Tudor family? If the blood relationship between him and the old Viscount is real, then things are going to be interesting. The entire Pound family is a branch of the Tudor family that changed its surname to escape pursuit? They contributed tremendously and were conferred aristocratic titles, and they returned to the center of power, one step at a time. Meanwhile, they were secretly searching for the secret remains left behind by the Tudor Empire in Backlund. After an unknown period of time, they finally found something. Thus, they bought what currently belongs to Millet Carter's house and built an exaggerated basement, which was used to explore the surrounding area. 30 to 40 years ago, they found the ruins and built a secret door to it. But, during the exploration process, an accident occurred. That evil spirit didn't recognize any of the so-called Tudor descendants at all. The 2 heirs of the old Viscount died in that room, in the deepest corner, one after the other. Even their Beyonder characteristics and mystical items couldn't be retrieved. Although the old Viscount spent a great price to buy similar Beyonder characteristics, making it seem like the 2 heirs had died relatively normal deaths, the consecutive deaths made the royal household and the churches suspicious. Therefore, after the old Viscount passed away, Rafter Pound deliberately exaggerated and distorted the secret investigations of the past, to frighten himself into having mental problems. He began to engage in debauchery so as to avoid the attention of others. This can explain what previously puzzled me. How can a Viscount family be placed under the control of some mysterious person without any action from the royal household and the churches? Even if controlling him was necessary, they would do it in a milder and undetectable manner. For example, using a faceless of my sequence 6 pathway. A child can even sense something abnormal, much less the powerful Beyonders of the royal household and the 3 churches? The reason why they were unaware can only be explained by the fact that they were the ones who had sent those people. Yes. Back then, I surmised that the Tudor family and the Trunsost family grasped the Dark Emperor pathway, so due to the need to act, they would establish dynasties to maintain the style and uniqueness of the Solomon Empire. On this point, Miss Bodyguard has indirectly proven it. The Dark Emperor pathway's sequence 9 is lawyer, a Beyonder job that is extremely good at using order. Yes, Rafter Pound was able to deceive my dream and spirit channeling abilities because of this. Perhaps he's gone one step further? He cooperated with me sufficiently, so in his muddled state in the dream, he was still able to subconsciously use the loophole of order and affect the development in the direction he wishes to have. Upon careful consideration, during the process of spirit channeling, Rafter Pound didn't seem to really lie. However, his truth was only a partial truth. Maintain the family, and remember the glory, can be referring to the Pound family and also the Tudor family. Klein's train of thought became clearer bit by bit, and he had an overall assessment of the situation. From Rafter Pound's current attitude, the evil spirit shouldn't be able to escape without any external help. Otherwise, the baronet would have long thought of a way to save himself. It doesn't matter if the evil spirit would come looking for him. As long as it escapes the seal and creates a disaster, the secret of the underground ruins would be exposed to the royal household and the churches. When that happens, Rafter will definitely be implicated. The room opposite had collapsed, but it didn't affect the power that restricted the evil spirit. This means that as long as the innermost room isn't directly destroyed, the evil spirit wouldn't be able to escape. The plan is clear then. I would buy some explosives from Kaspar's and collapse the entrance so that no one can get in, leaving the evil spirit buried underground forever. Hey, when I'm powerful enough, I can consider finishing it and help the citizens of Backland get rid of this latent danger and harvest some valuable items in the process. However, how should I collapse it safely? I don't know anything. Maybe Kaspar's knows a demolition expert? After all, he is a black market weapons merchant. Klein quickly finalized the plan and decided on finding Kaspar's tomorrow evening. He would try to settle the matter of the underground ruins within the week. As for the true relationship between the Pound family and the Tudor family, and for Rafter's abnormality, he didn't want to probe too deeply into it. It's none of my business. Klein grumbled and quickly plummeted down past the grey fog and returned to the real world. On Friday morning, Klein went out early as usual and pretended to be very busy. The truth was, he had once again gone to the Quelaag Club to practice his shooting and read the newspapers. He enjoyed himself quite a bit. At tea time, he was about to leave after staying there the entire day, but he was surprised to see Mary Gale, his former employer, and Talum Dumont, the equestrian teacher, enter the club at the same time. They were accompanied by a number of gentlemen in double-breasted frock coats and beautiful ladies in fine makeup. Among them was the Daily Observer reporter, Mike Joseph. Oh, Detective Moriarty, what a coincidence. Mike, with his charming eyes but rather rough skin, took the initiative to greet him. Klein smiled and replied, Mr. Reporter, are you done with your investigative news? It's done, thanks to your help. Let me do the introductions. This is the famous detective, Mr. Sherlock Moriarty, a good friend of Talum's. Mike waved his arm and said. After both sides greeted each other, Mike continued, I've roughly figured out who Capum is. I'll tell you in detail when I have the time. In short, I have every reason to believe that Cyber's death was caused by a copycat killer and not by the serial killer. Haha, you will see the news of my investigations on the papers tomorrow. It's just as I thought. Klein smiled in response. At that moment, Mike seemed to remember something and turned his head to Mary Gale and said, I'll make an appointment with you for an interview regarding the air pollution situation in Backland and its solution. However, you have to communicate with my editor-in-chief in advance to finalize the page in time. Mary's eyes lit up. All right, thank you very much, Mike. Why didn't I think of such a good idea? This is for the promotion of the National Atmospheric Pollution Council? This reporter, Mike, has quite a lot of experience after all. Although the Daily Observer isn't one of the best newspapers, its circulation is considerable. Did Mary suddenly come here today because the other members of the House of Commons who are members of this club were coming? This type of private club is indeed suitable for politics and business. Klein seemed to gain an understanding and bade farewell ahead of time. Before becoming a faceless, he didn't want to get involved in high-level affairs such as this. Evening, in an apartment in East Borough. After a busy day, Williams entered the small room he rented, intending to change his coat, get some money, go to the pub for a drink, and settle his dinner there. In the gloomy darkness, he suddenly stopped putting on his coat. He saw a shadow standing by the window, its face completely obscured by the shadow of the hood. Who told you to look for Lenivus? The dark figure asked in a low, slow voice. Williams quickly put on his coat, gulped his saliva, and said, I have a friend, a bounty hunter. Bounty hunters referred to adventurers who used various bounty rewards as their main source of income. There were a lot of them in East Borough and in Backland. Why did he suddenly start looking for Lenivus? This is a bounty that was offered a long time ago. The black figure was extremely tall. Step by step, he approached Williams. I don't know. Maybe she just wanted to attempt another bounty. Williams took a very tiny step back. The dark figure pressed hoarsely, Who is she? Williams immediately entered a dilemma, but after a few seconds, he replied with a trembling voice, Zio Derecha. I don't know where she lives. Very good, very honest. The black figure reached out and patted Williams's body. Without further ado, he walked towards the door. Williams secretly heaved a sigh of relief, believing that his rich experience in the underworld had helped him. Don't try to be brave when you shouldn't. At that moment, he saw the shadow snap his fingers. Paw! Williams's thoughts froze, and his body suddenly split into pieces, scattering in all directions, splattering the ground and walls with flesh and blood. Then, the shadow broke the gas pipe. Amidst the sound of gas spewing out from the pipes, he picked up the candle from Williams's desk and struck it against the wick. The black shadow left immediately. A few minutes later, the candle suddenly lit up by itself. Boom! The explosion wiped out everything. After dinner, in the billiard room of the Bravehearts bar. Dressed in a simple black coat and a dark cap, Klein held a glass of Southwell beer, closed the door behind him, and walked over to Kaspars, who was bent over the table, trying to hit the ball. Before he could muster a smile and say hello, Kaspars stopped what he was doing, straightened up, and glanced at him. Marich isn't here. There are no other gatherings you want. I have nothing but weapons. Ellipsis. Very familiar with what I want. Fortunately, I have a different goal today. Klein curled the corner of his lips and said, I'm here to buy weapons. Marich isn't here. From the looks of it, they've been exposed and are targeted by their enemies. They've decided to switch locations. Then I won't be able to contact Miss Bodyguard. And I was planning on tricking Millet Carter with Marich's zombies as my helpers. They'll keep a secret, they're obedient, and they're unafraid of death. Well, the premise of their obedience is when the influence of Azek's copper whistle is shielded. As he spoke, a series of thoughts flashed through Klein's mind. Kaspars was slightly surprised. With a look of suspicion, he leaned against his cue stick and rubbed his brandy nose and said, What kind of weapon are you looking to buy? Have you finished the previous bullets? That's quite a lot of practice. No, I practiced with bullets I bought at the Quelaag Club. Klein smiled. I want to buy explosives, the kind that is widely used in mines. What do you want to do? Kaspars blurted out as his expression turned solemn and stern. I'm warning you, don't try to do anything condemnable. I won't allow my customers to challenge Civilas Yard. Of course, you don't have to buy weapons from me. To be able to become a black market weapon merchant and live to this day, from a certain point of view, he must abide strictly by the rules. At the very least, he wouldn't sell to those crazy fellows. Klein habitually gave his evaluation from a Nighthawk's point of view and smiled. You seem to have misunderstood something. I'm not going to blast open the door of a bank vault or try to create any sensational news. I'm helping someone with the demolition of a building, making it easier for subsequent renovations. Then why didn't he find a proper construction company? Kaspars didn't let down his guard. Haha, that's a secret chamber. He doesn't want others to know about it. Klein switched to asking, do you know any reliable explosives experts? I'm not very good at this sort of thing, and I'm afraid the whole house will collapse. When Kaspars saw that Klein was making considerations to ensure that the house remained in good condition, the doubt in his mind was immediately dispelled quite significantly. Just as he was deliberating for an answer, an illusory voice suddenly rang out in the room. There's no need. A familiar feeling came over Klein. He quickly turned around and found Miss Bodyguard sitting on a chair in the corner without him realizing it. She was still wearing her black Gothic regal dress and matching soft hat. Her face was as pale as ever, and her blonde hair and delicate features accentuated each other. Good evening, madam. Klein slightly bent his back and bowed. Good evening, ma'am. Sharon. Kaspars did the same. So her name is Sharon. Klein thoughtfully waited for her to speak. The lady named Sharon looked at Kaspars and said, Marich won't be coming back here again. If you need him for anything, leave a message according to the third method. Yes, ma'am. Sharon. Kaspars, who had clearly seen a lot of things in his life, seemed to have an instinctive fear of Miss Bodyguard. Upon hearing this, Klein interrupted, if I wanted to get Marich's help, how should I get in touch with him? Through Kaspars, Sharon answered simply. All right. Klein spread out his hands and said, oh yeah, what did you mean when you said there's no need for a demolition expert? Sharon's blue eyes didn't waver in the slightest. I am one. You are one? You're a demolition expert? Wait a minute, aren't you a Beyander with special abilities, probably at Sequence 5? Why are you being a part-time demolition expert? Klein froze as he felt at a loss for words. In the end, he chose to believe Miss Bodyguard as he said in deliberation, I'm going to visit. Before he could finish, he looked at Kaspars. It was indicative that the ensuing topic wasn't suitable for this ordinary person. Fundamentally, due to his body, a black market weapons dealer is indeed considered an ordinary person. Klein silently added. Sharon looked at Kaspars and said, prepare the explosives. £2. He'll pay. Yes, ma'am. Sharon. Kaspars glanced at Klein and limped out of the billiard room, not forgetting to close the door behind him. Seeing Miss Bodyguard looking at him silently, Klein felt like he was being watched by a ghost. He quickly organized his words and said, I found Baronet Pound's address and visited him in the middle of the night. After recounting everything that Rafter Pound had told him, Klein began to deduce the process from the story. I think he lied in many areas, and it's impossible for a Viscount family to be so easily manipulated. If a child can notice something abnormal, how can the royal household and the churches not sense anything? After Rafter Pound degenerated, he had many chances to interact with outsiders and other aristocratic members. As long as he showed a little courage, he would be able to easily resolve the problem. Therefore, I think he must have been hiding something that has a high chance of being related to the underground structure. From the state of his mind, it seems that the evil spirit won't be able to escape for a long period of time, so I plan to get some explosives and destroy the entrance to prevent others from getting in. I'm afraid that I might accidentally release the evil spirit. Yes. Miss Bodyguard Sharon didn't confirm Klein's guess, but she didn't reject it either. At that moment, Klein hesitated and asked, I don't know much about demolition, so I'm preparing to draw a layout and hire a demolition expert to give me the positions to lay the explosives and their corresponding weights. If I ask you for help again, how much would I have to pay? If it's too expensive, it'd better for me to look for an ordinary demolition expert. After all, I'm getting only £50 from this, while Miss Bodyguard charges £1,000 for 3 days. Klein had already made plans. Free. Sharon's answer was still in her usual style of being terse. Free? Klein was shocked. From what he knew, free things cost the most. Sharon sat quietly for a few seconds before giving a brief explanation. After collapsing the entrance, I'll be the only one capable of entering and exiting. This was what I wished to do. In other words, after you're confident enough, you plan on getting rid of the evil spirit and harvest the items within? In fact, destroying the entrance is to help you eliminate any interferences or the greed of others. After all, other Beyonders of other sequences are unable to pass through the boulders and dirt like a spirit. Yes, apart from the apprentice pathway, but they don't know about that underground structure. Klein nodded in enlightenment. Deal. After saying that, he hurriedly added, Can you borrow a few more subordinates from Marich, subordinates with a tight lip? They'll be helpers to show to Millet Carter. All right. Sharon didn't refuse. Klein deliberately didn't mention making any payment for that as he smiled. Then, let's schedule it for 10 in the morning tomorrow. We have to explore the surrounding terrain in advance. We can't let the explosion cause any obvious damage. Sharon nodded slightly as her figure faded away into nothingness. Saturday morning, Zio de Recha once again rode in a public carriage to the East Borough to confirm any results that her commissions might have. While waiting for the transfer, she suddenly had the urge to buy a newspaper to read. She took out a penny and bought a copy of the Backland Bulletin from a paperboy next to her. She quickly read through it. Suddenly, her eyes froze because of the news article on the third page. At 7:10 last night, there was a serious explosion in the apartment building at 1 Dharavi Street in East Borough. It's suspected to be a result of a gas leak. The explosion happened at unit number 0306. The tenant died on the spot, to the point of not leaving a complete corpse. At press time, this explosion resulted in 3 deaths and 16 injured. 1 Dharavi Street, apartment number 0306. Isn't this the place Williams rents? He's dead? He died from a gas leak explosion? No, absolutely impossible. He would never be so extravagant and use gas, even if there was an installation there. Did he end up like this because he had just accepted my commission? But Lenevis is a wanted criminal. If he discovers that someone was looking for him, all he should need to do is move. There's no need to kill people to keep it a secret. Doing so would instead expose problems. The way this was done is too weird and radical, it's like it was done by a lunatic. He's clearly just a swindler. Poor Williams. I will definitely avenge you. I'll definitely find out the truth. Zio looked sadly and gravely at the public carriage parked in front of her and didn't choose to board it. She knew that it would be very dangerous to head to East Borough now. She intended to go back at once and tell Furs to get her to move to a spare rental house. Then, she would head to East Borough in a disguise and ask someone familiar to gain a preliminary understanding of the reason and find traces of the killer's tracks. Sigh, it's true that none of Miss Audrey's commissions are without danger. I thought that as long as I didn't stop someone who is already a wanted swindler and didn't stop him from escaping, he wouldn't retaliate in such a vicious manner. I was careless. I was the one who caused Williams's death. Well, that didn't exclude the possibility that he was also gathering information on other matters, thereby bringing about disaster. Zio closed her eyes and crossed the street to the waiting area on the other side. At 10:14, after confirming the surface conditions of the fourth epic structure, Klein and Miss Bodyguard, Sharon, arrived outside the building at 8 Williams Street. Sharon had already vanished, and Millet Carter saw Detective Sherlock Moriarty in his grayish-blue worker's uniform and cap and his 3 taciturn assistants. It's convenient to explore like this, Klein explained. Millet Carter's eyes swept across the 3 assistants who were obviously good at fighting and nodded in satisfaction. Your preparations were quicker than I expected. Is one of them a snake-repelling expert? Yes, they're very good at repelling snakes. Klein didn't hesitate to give an affirmative answer. How could a zombie be afraid of being bitten by snakes? In the dark underground structure, Klein walked around the hall with a raised lantern in his hand. He thoroughly checked to see if there were any other entrances. Of course, he didn't dare enter the tunnel that led to the innermost room, and the newly gathered snakes were, once again, blown away by a biting cold wind. After receiving confirmation, he took the initiative to retreat to the side of the gate, where he watched, along with the 3 zombies, as Sharon placed explosives at different locations. She looks very professional. Klein sighed softly. And without a doubt, the 3 zombies didn't respond to his musings. However, there was a reason for this. He kept using his spirituality to wrap Azek's copper whistle so as to shield against its negative effects. Otherwise, he would have encountered their abnormally passionate response. He had no intention of bringing this ancient and exquisite copper whistle with him originally, but considering that he had to guard against the evil spirit's manipulations, he could only sacrifice some of his spirituality. Miss Bodyguard, no, Miss Sharon said that she's a demolition expert, and from the looks of it, she really isn't bragging. Was she in this line of work in the past? Or does one of her sequences in her Beyonder pathway make her skilled in this domain? According to the information I read back in the Nighthawks, a few candidates like Sequence 9 Criminal, Prisoner, Warrior, and Hunter, Sequence 8 Sheriff, and Sequence 7 Weapon Master and Knowledge Keeper. Hey, the latter has a nickname, Detective. It's part of the Church of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom. As for the rest, I'm completely clueless. I wonder which pathway Miss Sharon is. Nothing seems to match, and she even showed her ability to command the zombies. While Klein's thoughts wandered and made all sorts of associations, Sharon finished setting up the explosives and, in passing, lit the fuse. In passing? Lighting the fuse? Hey, hey, hey! Why didn't you give any warning? Only then did Klein jolt back to his senses and was startled. He quickly rushed out of the hall and entered the corridor outside. As for the 3 zombies, they calmly followed behind him. It's very safe here. Sharon suddenly appeared and floated beside him. Klein breathed a sigh of relief and asked, will dust fall from the tremors over here? Yes, Sharon answered with a single word. That's good. As he spoke, Klein took another step back. The hissing sound of the fuse burning reached his ears, making him feel slightly irritated. It wasn't because he was afraid of the explosion that followed, but because he couldn't feel at ease. Sharon said suddenly. Huh? Klein didn't understand what she meant. Rumble. The earth shook violently, and plumes of dust fell from above. Klein's ears buzzed, and for a moment he couldn't hear anything else. If it wasn't for the fact that he was a clown, he would have lost his balance and collapsed to the ground. Cough. 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 Having been distracted and caught unaware, he started to cough. He saw boulders and mud rapidly falling in front of him as they instantly blocked the entrance. During the remaining tremors, Klein gripped the copper whistle given to him by Mr. Azek and observed its reaction. Although he had divined beforehand that his expedition would be safe, he didn't dare to believe it completely, even if it was a revelation gained from above the grey fog, since it involved the statues of the 6 Orthodox gods. Therefore, he cautiously judged whether or not the evil spirit was freed with the help of Azek's copper whistle. The copper whistle's surface was cold but mild, and it had no abnormal changes. Completely relieved, Klein looked at the zombies beside him and confirmed one thing from their eyes. His face was very dirty right now. That's good. It's in line with how I'm going to explain this to old Mr. Millet Carter. I didn't waste my effort in changing into a different set of clothes. He walked to the entrance and confirmed that it was completely blocked. Without causing too much a commotion, it's true that only those from the apprentice path and beyonders like Miss Sharon can enter in the future. By doing so, she has ruled out many potential competitors. No wonder it was free. Klein looked at the boulders and dirt before sighing. Of course, I can too. I have a condition similar to a spirit body. He silently added this sentence inwardly with a smile, but his expression didn't change at all. Let's call it a day. With an exaggerated snap of his fingers, Klein led the 3 zombies back to the basement of the house. As for Sharon, she had already disappeared. In the spacious basement, Millet Carter was nervously pacing back and forth, looking at the secret door from time to time. As soon as he saw Detective Moriarty and his assistants exit, he let out a long breath and asked anxiously, "What happened inside?" Klein deliberately panted and said, "That underground structure is too old, it hasn't been repaired in a long time. We were driving the snakes away, but with just a little bit of movement, it collapsed. The whole area has collapsed, but luckily we were close to the door and managed to escape in time." Holy Lord of Storms! That structure was that dangerous? Millet Carter pounded his left breast. Yes, there are always only a few ancient buildings that can be preserved. The rest would have collapsed in the river of history, Klein answered. I'll bring you in to confirm the situation. Will there be more collapses? Millet asked cautiously. No, this area is quite sturdy. Klein deliberately patted the dust off his body and coughed twice. He then led his employer in and stopped at the entrance that was completely blocked. The walls near the hall had also collapsed, leaving behind only stones and dirt. You can use this area. He pointed to the corridor area. Millet was silent for a few seconds before he sighed. Thank goodness I didn't hastily send someone in to explore but instead went to look for you, a professional. Otherwise, I would have had to bear the burden of the loss of several lives. All right, this commission ends here. I'll pay you the rest of the reward. As he spoke, Millet Carter took out his wallet, did a count, and was somewhat embarrassed to find that there were only about £30 in cash. Fortunately, I still have other forms of money. Otherwise, I'd have to go to the bank, Millet mumbled as he looked up at Klein. Do you mind taking gold coins? No, I don't mind any form of money. Klein smiled. The gold pound of the Lowen Kingdom could be in the form of gold coins unless they were of huge denominations. This was the guarantee of the denomination on paper money. However, in the past 100 years after Emperor Russell, the people of the northern continent had become more and more accustomed to paper money. There were even some members of parliament who wanted notes to replace copper pennies. Gold, in the true sense of the word, already hardly ever circulated in the market. Only some of the old gentlemen would attach a fixed box on the other end of their pocket watch chains which contained some gold in case of accidents. It was to give them peace of mind and was also a habit. Millet nodded, and following the gold chain on his clothes, he pulled out a box that flickered with golden light from a certain pocket. He opened the box, took out 5 gold coins, and handed them together with the notes he had previously counted to the detective. Klein didn't hide his actions as he counted the money and suddenly flicked a gold coin and caught it coolly. Thank you for your generosity. He glanced up at the statue and smiled sincerely. Then he pressed his hand to his chest and bowed whilst facing Millet Carter. Yes, if it were any other detective, even if they demolished the entrance and the passageway, they would definitely have nightmares upon returning. They would hear things at home, and their minds will turn weak. They would feel like they're being watched all the time and experience other problems. That's the corruption of the evil spirit's aura. It will take a very long time before the effects disappear, but we're different. Miss Sharon is like a ghost to begin with. As for me, I'll be completely fine once I go above the grey fog. As for the 3 zombies, they aren't even afraid of death, so what's there to be afraid of? Klein lampooned while in a good mood as he bade Millet Cullen farewell and left his house. Arriving on the street, without even informing him, the 3 zombies walked in another direction. Miss Sharon is gone. She really didn't collect any money for the zombies. Klein smiled as he raised his arm and waved at the departing backs of the 3 zombies. Then, he went home and changed into his normal clothes and headed for the Quelaag Club to practice shooting. After also settling his dinner there as a reward for the successful completion of his mission, Klein returned to Minsk Street in a public carriage. The dark, gloomy environment was illuminated by gas lamps, and with his cane, he strolled leisurely along the street. Suddenly, he had a premonition which wasn't too good or bad. What's going on? When Klein looked up, he saw 2 police constables with a dog on a leash, apparently investigating the streets. Investigation? An investigation with a police dog? Is this a result of the serial killings? The scene of the murder had the smell of cloves and gooseberries, so they included a police dog? Klein couldn't help but silently lampoon. The history of dogs dated back as far as the Russell period, but the numbers had always been small. Considering that he had many things on him, and considering his earlier premonition, Klein decided to take a detour. But at that moment, the 2 policemen saw him and signaled for him to stop. The corner of Klein's mouth twitched as he waited in place with a smile on his face. Routine investigation. As they approached, one of the officers showed his identification documents. All right. Before Klein could finish his sentence, the police dog suddenly growled at him and barked endlessly. Is it because of the smell of gunpowder on me? The smell of gunpowder from my afternoon practice? Klein instantly realized what was happening. He looked at the faces of the two officers who were now on alert. With a thought, he smiled and said, "It's this, I picked up a revolver along the way, along with an armpit holster and bullets. I was planning on handing them over to the police." Slowly, he took out his revolver, raised his hands to his shoulders, and added with a serious smile, "Officers, I really am not bearing a gun illegally." As one constable remained on high alert, the other constable received the revolver and said seriously, "You have to come back to the police station with us." "All right," Klein returned with a radiant smile. "But I have a request. Please inform my lawyer, Mr. Jurgen Cooper. I will only accept a body search with him around." In a corner of East Borough, a drunken Zeon faced the wall, pulled off his pants, and began watering the moss in comfort. When he was done, someone suddenly patted his shoulder. Zeon couldn't help but shiver a few times. He picked up his pants and half turned to see a short boy in a canvas jacket and cap. The boy raised his head, revealing a mild and delicate face despite looking dirty. "Zio? Why are you dressed like that?" Zeon blurted out in surprise. Zio put her index finger to her lips to indicate the need for silence. Then, she suppressed her voice and said, "I'll ask and you answer." "Keep your voice down." Astonished by her awe-inspiring presence, Zeon could only nod. "Which of the guys, that Williams knew, have died within the past 2 days?" Zio asked in a low voice. Zeon used his alcohol-paralyzed brain to carefully think for a while and said, "Gavin. Gavin was found to have drowned in the Tussock River this morning. He probably fell into the river last night. The poor sod doesn't know how to swim and likes to enjoy the wind by the river when he's drunk." Zio's gaze suddenly became sharp. Without any hesitation, she asked, "Did Gavin accept Williams's request to look for the wanted criminal, Lenevis?" "Of course, we all got this commission from Williams. Anyway, it's not like it's a big deal. All we have to do is show the portrait to everyone we know and keep an eye out for someone who looks like him." "Oh, Williams, he said that if there's a clue, he'll treat me to 3 days of booze and meat. The poor fellow actually died in a gas explosion. That's why I refused to have my landlord install a gas pipe." That was months ago. I can only afford a cheap motel now," Jean droned on. "What region is Gavin in charge of? Did he mention anything to you?" Zio looked sideways, pursed her lips, and stared straight at Zeon. He usually goes to the dock area near the East Balam dock. He even met me yesterday evening and said that he went to the Workers' Alliance Tavern there to spread the news of his search for Lenevis, and he also showed the portrait of Lenevis to everyone present." Jean hiccuped. There were many docks in Backland, most of which were considered as the dock area and designated as shipyards. "And after that? Did Gavin say what he was going to do?" Zio asked again, frowning doubtfully. "Of course, drinking. He planned to have a good drink and then find a place to sleep. Oh, the poor sod must have felt hot from drinking and wanted to take a bath in the river, but he forgot he couldn't swim, and it's almost winter." Zeon sighed again. Gavin didn't discover anything. He had gone to the Workers' Alliance Tavern in East Balam Dock and distributed leaflets to search for Lenevis, but ended up meeting his demise. It even implicated Williams. The murderer's reaction can no longer be described as extreme anymore. He's simply a lunatic. If I were Lenevis, the easiest option would be to immediately move somewhere else and avoid being found. Unless he's embroiled in something and cannot leave anytime soon. But I wasn't the only one looking for him. There are also many bounty hunters. He may kill Williams, but can he kill that many people? If he had the ability, he would kill off everyone who spread wanted posters in Civilas Yard. Zio was completely befuddled by the entire matter, just like how she found Williams's death was impossible. In the end, she decided to report the problem to Miss Audrey first, and then head to the Workers' Alliance Tavern in East Balam in disguise. She wouldn't make any inquiries and only observe to see if there was anyone suspicious. Sherwood Borough. Rice Police Station. Once again, Klein found himself huddled on a backrest-equipped bench with thieves and drunkards. How unlucky. To think that I would run into the police and fail to take a detour in time. It's all because of that damn serial killer. As Klein cursed that particular person, he thought about how to hide his charms and the herbal powder he couldn't explain away and dodge the body search that followed. He had tried to put them in his black gloves, then find a chance to slip them into a hidden spot in the police station, only to retrieve them when he left. Just then, his eyes lit up and he saw the young lawyer, Jurgen Cooper, with his hair neatly combed back. He was dressed like he was attending a banquet. Just as Cooper came over, he was accompanied by a police constable. You can leave after signing your name, Jurgen said with his usual serious expression. Is that all? Klein asked in surprise. Jurgen nodded slightly. Yes, they know you're a well-known detective. What kind of reason is this? Klein didn't dare to ask further. He immediately got up and followed after Jurgen, who was wearing a long black tweed coat. He signed his name at a leisurely pace before leaving. The weather was different from the last time he was led out from the police station by Jurgen. There was no rain and only thick clouds obscuring the crimson moon and stars. The streets were illuminated by gas lamps that lined both sides of the streets. Thank you so much. I've troubled you once again. Klein briskly walked forward and came to Jurgen's side. Jurgen turned his head to look at him and said to him without a smile, "There's no need to thank me. This is my job. £2. Quote. Klein sized him up seriously and revealed a smile. Okay. His wallet was bulging recently, and he produced 2 £1 notes at once. Without a trace of politeness, Jurgen received the payment and said, "If you're willing to enter into a formal partnership, then every time you come to the police station, I'll only charge you £1. Of course, not for the cases that are serious. You have to understand that a large portion of the fees I charge will go to the office. It's as if I would frequently be invited to the police station for some coffee in the future. Pooey, they don't even give coffee. Theirs isn't even a cup of water." Before Klein could answer, he heard Jurgen add, "For a private detective, getting in and out of the police station is something that happens every once in a while. It's an occupational hazard. Well, I know very well that every private detective has a problem with the illegal bearing of arms and the illegal trespassing in other people's homes. Your response this time was very good. The police couldn't find enough evidence to prove that you were bearing a gun illegally, and the explanation for the gunpowder reaction on your body was quite sufficient. The name Quelaag Club was enough to convince them. Otherwise, you most likely would have had to go to the magistrate's court. So, you're not a suspect, but a good citizen. A good citizen who picked up a gun and handed it in, so there was no need for a body search. All right, but I lost a revolver and the corresponding bullets. That's several pounds, and there's also the lawyer's fee." Klein squeezed out a smile. "I understand. Lawyer Jurgen, let's establish a formal partnership." The corner of Jurgen's mouth twitched. With an extremely professional smile, he extended his hand and said, "I hope for a pleasant partnership. I sincerely hope that I don't have to see you too often at the police station. That's not something that's up to me to decide." Klein gave a self-deprecating laugh. Back at 15 Minsk Street, Klein eased himself with a hot bath. But at that moment, he once again heard illusory prayers coming from a woman. "Miss Justice? Is there a clue regarding Lenivus?" Klein suddenly jumped out of the bathtub, quickly dried his body, put on his clothes, and went above the grey fog. Staring at the constantly expanding and shrinking crimson star, he extended his spirituality and chose to listen. "The fool that doesn't belong to this era. Honorable Mr. Fool, there's been a problem with the investigation of Lenivus, Justice, who was wearing a white gown for an unknown reason, recounted the explosion that happened on Dharavi Street in East Borough, as well as Gavin's drowning. As a telepathist, who had already gained some mastery, she didn't add her own guesses, lest it affect the judgment of Mr. Fool." After listening carefully, Klein frowned, feeling that the killer's reaction was unimaginably extreme. Unlike Rear Admiral Hurricane Kilongos, Lenivus, as a swindler, would immediately move if he discovered anything was amiss. That should be his professional instinct. There's no reason to follow the clues in reverse and kill those who are seeking him. According to this standard, 80% of East Borough's bounty hunters would die. This would cause a sensation and cause the case to be taken over by the Nighthawks, mandated punishers, or machinery hivemind. Has the benefits Lenivus gained, from the ritual of praying to the true creator to send his son down, left him mad? This is very consistent with the style of the true creator. However, the problem lies with the fact that it would be difficult for a lunatic to hide himself. Apart from the potential, Klein fell into deep thought and was in no hurry to respond to Miss Justice. He had read the newspapers and known about the explosion, so he used dream divination to recall the details. Then he wrote a new divination statement. Clues to the explosion in Dharavi Street. As he recited it silently, he leaned back in his chair and entered a dream. He saw a 3-story, grayish-blue apartment. On the 3rd floor of the apartment, a room had lost its windows and half the wall had been destroyed. It was filled with signs of an explosion. The scene quickly shattered. Klein woke up from his reverie as he tapped the edge of the table and thought to himself. The clues are at the scene of the crime? Ellipsis. This revelation can also mean that the murderer is still watching the crime scene and wants to finish off the person who comes to investigate the matter. Yes. This will give him a chance to find the person who recently issued the bounty for Lenivus. I'll visit the crime scene in disguise and see if I can find the killer. Even if he isn't Lenivus, he must surely be connected to Lenivus. But he must have hidden himself very well. How can I find him without attracting his attention? A thought flashed as Klein's eyes was cast onto the all-black eye on the long bronze table. This was a Beyonder characteristic left behind by the Nimblewright master Rosago. In the real world, I can't use this item to manipulate those strange threads because of the residual mental corruption from the true creator. There will be irreversible harm after interacting with it for a certain amount of time. However, if it was used temporarily, I can use the threads to find a hidden person. That's something acceptable. It's just like how I used it to determine if Miss Bodyguard had left previously. Klein narrowed his eyes, removed his spirit pendulum, and divined if his trip would be dangerous. The answer was positive, but the amplitude and frequency of the spinning weren't excessive. That's acceptable. Klein was silent for a few seconds before returning to the real world. Then, by summoning himself, he placed the all-black eye into an iron cigarette case and brought it back to his bedroom. After changing his clothes, sticking his beard on, and getting ready, Klein came before the mirror and examined himself. The faint scholarly vibe that he had was completely concealed by the beard on his face, and his brown eyes seemed to be like an ancient pool which hid and sealed something within. Compared to when he was in Tingen City, Klein almost didn't recognize himself. One by one, he stretched out his fingers and clenched them into a fist. Looking at the mirror, he said in a low and hoarse voice, "Captain, this is the first step to avenging both you and me." Before he finished his sentence, he saw himself grinning in the mirror, a brilliant smile on his face.